A wild week one Sunday, scoring down a little bit around the league, but we got some fun moments. We're going to recap all of it. We're going to talk through everything as Shawn Siegele joins. It's Stealing Bananas on the Stealing Signals YouTube. Let's do it. Shawn, how are we doing? It was a long Sunday. Sunday's always, it's always kind of a tough one. You go into it with an idea of how everything's going to go, and the stuff that goes the way that you were envisioning doesn't necessarily feel as good as the stuff that doesn't go the way you were envisioning feels bad, right? Because that stuff, I already knew what that was going to be right. It was already there in my head. I could already visualize all those things. But the stuff that went way different than I was visualizing, it's a little overwhelming sometimes.
There's so much. And there was a lot of good, a decent amount of bad. There was also, unfortunately, a decent amount of ugly, not necessarily from a fantasy perspective as well. But then the NFL knows which games to send to Thursday night and Friday night ahead of the season. And they know which game to put on Sunday Night Football. A lot of the rest of the games were pretty rough. Now, there was a fantastic game between the Texans and the Colts, but a lot of the rest of the games were pretty rough.
Yeah, and I was saying that to some people, I think still out in Vegas, chatting up some different people, that those first two games are going to give people sort of the wrong impression, I thought, about what we were about to see on Sunday, because we talked a lot about the offensive counterpunch last year, all those things. It never really came. Scoring was down again last year. There wasn't really a clear indication of why we would expect that this year. The first two games felt like, the first couple games a half decade ago when the NFL was in a different era might feel. But a lot of that was because those are four of the best offenses we kind of expect to see, or at least when the Packers get Jordan Love back. A lot of different teams playing today. We got a lot of rookie quarterbacks playing. And a lot of takeaways from those. Real quick, before we get going, the sort of what is the word I'm trying to, the administrative stuff, right? So one of the things that I got to mention, we talk about it on this show, and we have in past years, and people might remember, but for anyone who isn't aware, anyone who's watching live, what have you, Shawn and I watch the games a little bit differently. I watch all the games at once on different screens, and I tend to miss a few things here and there because of that. I had some technical difficulties in the morning. I missed the first few drives in a couple of games. You record all the games and watch through them sort of one at a time throughout the day quickly, like watch through them quickly and then get up to speed and then go to a different one and get up to speed, watch a couple at a time. So whenever we record our Sunday night shows, there's often a couple that you haven't had a chance to get through yet, but you're also watching them a lot more intently. So I always love to talk with you about things that I saw or hear things that you saw that maybe I didn't catch when I was trying to watch 8 games at once in the morning window. But there are a couple games
you
that
process the games amazingly well for having them all up there. I don't know how you do. Sometimes when I'm at the sports bar, I'm watching them, I'm kind of enjoying, but you miss most of the things. I miss plenty, watching through the way I do as well. There's so much going on, and you're not going to be able to watch the way someone who's responsible for charting a game for some type of organization is going to be able to do.
Right. But on that note, you had sent over to me the couple that you haven't gotten to yet are the Saints and Panthers, the Patriots and Bengals, the Chargers and Raiders. We probably won't spend a lot of time on any of those games because you haven't seen them yet. Not too much to discuss from those games. There's so much to discuss.
Doesn't seem like things have turned around, though, in terms of who should have been the number one pick last year.
Who should have been the number one pick last year?
Right. It seems like it's still not Bryce Young.
Still not Bryce. I was thinking fantasy number one pick. I was like, what? Yeah, the I was.
It's just a bummer because it would have been fun if they had come out. I don't know what happened in that game, but sometimes you're not planning to watch a game and then you watch the bottom line and now I don't even want to watch it tomorrow or the next day. So
Shawn,
that's pretty rough.
it was rough. I was, I was really into Deontay Johnson. I was hoping that team would at least look competent at times. One of the tweets that I sent out today, I did a lot of tweeting today. I was having a good time during the first drive. That was something like their baseline for today wasn't high. They didn't have to do a lot to have some optimism. They just needed to be like below average and I said like, i.e. not terrible. And they did not reach that bar.
Well, one of the things that stood out to me this offseason that I thought was a bit odd because it seemed to break some of the coaching code, although obviously you can say what you want. But there's been a lot of discussion about how the Canales effect and how that worked in different places he's been, and then he leaves, and then the Bucs were decent last year, and John Gruden was like, "Why are we giving them so much credit? They still didn't score any points." And I mean, there was a pretty big contrast today between the Buccaneers and the Panthers. Now, the Buccaneers played a team that is apocalyptically bad on defense. And so one of the things that you have to try and remember as you're working through this is that there are very different calibers of defense that these teams are facing.
Yeah, that's a great point. That is something you said you've seen the bottom line. The Saints had an incredible day today. They're one of the other offenses that were incredible. It seemed to me like the Panthers defense is also just as bad as their offense, but that's another great point there. Washington's D looked very poor today. Washington's offense was fun. I mean, it wasn't great, but as far as the rookie QBs went, we saw, 88 rushing yards and 2 rushing TDs out of Jaden Daniels. Some more fun late as he started to get pressed. Bo Nix is a guy, Shawn, we did a lot of talking about. I was worried about him heading to a pretty raucous environment on the road in Seattle against Mike McDonald, who everyone will – if you polled the league's executives and said who is at the forefront of most innovative defensive, systems right now, I think he would probably be the runaway winner, the way that you hear people talk about him. And Nix looked so good in the preseason. And I saw a lot of reactions to Nix that were like, oh, he's just obviously terrible. They burned their 12th overall pick. I saw somebody tweet. I can't remember who it was. I'm not trying to call that person out individually, but I saw that comment. They may be right, but it's a very big exaggeration. It's a big claim on the opening game. We have seen rookies play very poorly at the quarterback position. Like Peyton Manning famously had a really bad full rookie season and then, really turn around in year 2.
It was interesting. I thought that they were willing to throw, 42 passes? That's not the situation where the head coach is like, our guy can't play, let's hide him. I think it's a lot scarier when the coach doesn't want to throw passes and when the quarterback doesn't want to pull the trigger. There were a lot of bad passes today from Bo Nix, but he wasn't scared of anything. I was desperately hoping they would get a stop because the thing you want to see is after a game like that, if you get a final drive to come back and win it, it would change everybody's perception of everything, but they couldn't tackle on defense on that final drive. He ran the ball. It's actually one of these stealth things for fantasy where it was pretty cool because one of the things about some of these other guys like, Anthony Richardson, and we'll talk about that game at length. That game was awesome. But the rushing value is huge. If he runs like he ran today, all he has to do is remain a starter, and he's going to be valuable for you because the Denver Broncos are not going to pull the plug on that anytime soon. Right,
and we saw a ton of running back targets in this game. Javonte Williams only has the 1 catch. McLaughlin has 5. They combined for 1 receiving yard. It was not great. The Seahawks, I think, very clearly had the right defensive scheme to beat what the Broncos wanted to do. And then everyone was like, oh, it's the same crap with Bo Nix. He can't throw downfield because that was the knock on him out of Oregon. My perception of it was that Seattle was giving him looks down the field that he very clearly didn't see in the preseason and wasn't processing and was having trouble throwing into defenders. He threw 2 picks, but they dropped like 3 or 4 more. Like it was,
I don't know if it was that many, but they were bad passes. But the other thing about it was the Cortland Sutton played terrible football. And I don't know why you would get rid of Jerry Jeudy and not get rid of Cortland Sutton, who made no effort today.
That was weird how he was not playing hard. Yeah.
They threw 42 passes and they do not have a starting caliber wide receiver out there. I don't understand why Troy Franklin's not playing. I don't know why you wouldn't use Marvin Mims because the 3 guys they had out there today who drew a bunch of targets cannot play.
Devon Villay, the rookie 27-year-old. Yeah. But he got 8 targets. He caught 8 passes for 39 yards. Saw a lot of him today. Saw a lot of Josh Reynolds. Saw a lot of Cortland Sutton. It was a little bit trickier. Yeah, so I mean, the way that I always thought of the Sean Payton offense, and we talked about the way that they might use like Marvin Mims and Troy Franklin and those guys rotationally, is they would take those deep shots with like a Meacham or a Henderson, and that would open up the underneath passing. And in this game, they didn't have any of that vertical speed. They just had all the size receivers on, and that's why I never really thought that the 3 size receivers thing that people were talking about in the preseason would last, because it didn't make a lot of sense to me if you're not threatening vertically. I think we saw the issue today where the Seahawks basically did not ever get threatened and then just were clamping down to the degree that even when they were able to complete the passes to the running backs, they weren't able to get any, space to operate in. You have to stretch out the defense vertically, right? The safeties have to get a little deeper. That second level has to respect the intermediate crossers because the safeties are deeper. If everything's coming down because you're not going over the top at any point, because you don't even have Marvin Mims and Troy Franklin on the field who have the speed and the ability to do that, none of it actually makes any sense. I've been really high on this offense, but it doesn't work. And then you get the responses that are like, Bo Nix is terrible. He can't throw downfield. I mean, you would have a really different perception of his low ADOT if it was set up the way it was in the preseason. He had, I think, 6 or 7 drives. They scored on all but one, and that was a skill position fumble. After a completed pass, a guy fumbled. They moved the ball easily. Now, those are vanilla defenses, but I also think when they play a non-Mike McDonald coach defense, we may still see that type of stuff. But I think it's going to
be a learning process. I think it's going to be a growth
I'm sure
process.
It will be.
Well, one of the things that I try to tell people about the preseason is that's not indicative of what is going to happen. It's good that he looks good, because you do need to look good when they're playing those defenses.
But the other thing they did is they would throw vertically a little bit in the preseason. Like they did take a couple shots. He had like a couple.
Well, he threw some balls down the field today, just not effectively. And I think that they will. And this kind of, wraps back around to our discussion the other night, or just last night when we were drafting, where we said, you take Marvin Mims here, and then if he doesn't do anything, you cut him. And that's fine. That's perfect, which we will cut him, and we'll go after some people who were involved. The whole idea there, again, and it is effective when you hit on the guys. Like I have Jalen McMillan in every single draft that I've done in the last 3 weeks in any format. And if you get the one hit, and Ben, I don't know for sure that we know it's a hit, but he could have had a massive day today. And the other one that it's pricier, but Adonai Mitchell could have had a monster game. But the throws that Richardson made to Pierce, and Pierce made a couple of amazing catches. The second one, especially, the defense made a terrible play on. You got to knock down. But
Mitchell was the best throw of the day by any quarterback.
I actually think that the touchdown pass he threw to Doolin, where there was some run after the catch, but he's kind of on the move and he rockets it back across his body a little bit into the center of the field. You see that cannon. It's crazy.
Cannon too, where he's falling down a little bit.
But that one is kind of a Hail Mary-ish type of play. The other one is one where you hit a guy in stride in the middle of the field. You let him run after the catch and you showed off the massive arm. It was so fun because he had like 3 of the 4 or 5 best throws of the day, and then like every other throw was terrible. But
it was horrible. He completed 9 passes out of 19 attempts, and there were a lot of misses. You mentioned the 2 Mitchell misses. Definitely have those in the notes for stealing signals, because Mitchell could have had a huge day. He
could have had 2 long touchdowns and another like 30-yard catch.
He's open on those. Some of the other misses are short, intermediate passes, are passes that you gotta hit. But I called him an enigma on Twitter when I was tweeting him. Like, you have the best pass of the day, and then a couple plays later, I'm concerned about you. Well, the one where Mitchell wins on the double move, I always get mad about this. When a guy's that open, you have to be able to take something off of it and underthrow it. Know where your miss is. I've went on rants about this every year we've done stealing bananas in season. Mitchell wins on the double move so early in the route that Richardson has not released the ball yet, and the defender bit hard. You just can lob that up and let him fair catch it and then walk in the end zone. But he tries to throw a very precise pass, and he winds up overshooting it by like 3 yards. When there's no defender, there's no safety coming over, there's no one anywhere. He can honestly underthrow it by 10 yards, and it's a touchdown. That one was like, how does the same guy that just made that last pass in the last drive make this pass?
Well, again, it's the reason that he's. You could make an argument that he's the most exciting player in football.
Sure.
Because the athletic tools are so crazy. And I'm looking forward to watching him play every week, because if you're rooting for him, you're in great shape. You're going to score a ton of fantasy points. If you're rooting against him, you're going to have these hilarious moments every game. There was a segment early in the game, and it really was in some ways definitive. I mean, the Colts lost because of all the bad passes. They were only in the game because of the two amazing passes and the amazing effort when, I mean, Jonathan Taylor looked awful and, couldn't get in. And then Anthony Richardson was like, well, I'll just carry 3 defenders into the end zone to show you how it's done. Right.
On 4th down. Yeah.
You have that early exchange where both teams have the key short conversion, and the Colts go on 4th down and have a guy wide open underneath, and Anthony Richardson throws it nowhere close to him. CJ Stroud has a similar type of play, somehow falls on the ground, and then basically prostrate completes the pass for the conversion. Like, that's the contrast in caliber of passer. The guys are going to finish really close in fantasy points.
I do. Yeah. I mean, Richardson's going to score a lot. I do wish I was a little more open to that. I do have some shares because he did get a little bit cheap late. So he's an enigma, right? There's still some stuff to talk about in addition to that, but I think that is the headline. And obviously, he only completed 9 passes for 212 yards. You look at the receiving lines. One of the reasons we weren't in on Michael Pittman was it's a very different offense when you're talking about Anthony Richardson versus Gardner Minshew. He gets 8 targets to easily lead the team, but they only threw 19 passes. He gets 4 catches for 31 yards, right? You mentioned Adonai Mitchell had a couple near misses, but when you miss in this offense, it's 5 targets for 1 catch and 2 yards. Alec Pierce hits, it's 3 catches for 125 and a TD. Doolin has the 1 catch for 54 and a TD. There's 9 catches, right? Like, there's not a lot of volume there to go around. The running backs don't catch a pass. The tight ends don't catch a pass. There's not a lot as far as the impact on the skill players. That's something that we obviously need to think through as well.
It's going to be a great offense for him. It's not going to be a good offense for anyone else. If you have Mitchell,
so you think about
I think you're going to have some huge spike weeks.
Right.
One of the things that was so odd is that if you look at the recent
stacking, I just wanted to make a point about DFS and in best ball. The idea of stacking, you're making a great point here. That, I mean, putting Richardson with these guys in DFS going forward and that kind of thing is going to be tricky. You probably want to think about playing him solo. Sorry, but go ahead.
One of the interesting contrasts this week was, I mean, you think about where Barkley has been with his peripherals and where Taylor has been with his peripherals, and Taylor's got some red flags as well, but has had some good evasion numbers. And in terms of the long speed, you have that touchdown at the end of last season that I believe was one of the fastest time plays of the year. And so again, when you're talking about Taylor, a lot of what you need is the big play, but it's also something where he's better at evading tackles at the line of scrimmage than sometimes people give him credit for. That part is important because one of the things we also saw from Achane today is that it's once you evade the tackle, and a little bit from Gibbs. I mean, these guys, it's you evade the tackle and then you have the long playability. It'll be interesting to track how the defenses perform going forward because the Eagles, with some similarities. Now, partly it's the A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith are much bigger threats, and the defense has to account for them. You could argue that if you're going to give up all those long touchdowns that the Texans gave up today, you have to account for that stuff too. Teams are possibly going to say, we just don't think that stuff can be repeated. Not that there aren't going to be big plays, even just a handful of plays last season. Obviously, Richardson made some big time throws deep, but the Eagles were able to create that space for Barkley, and then he was able to take advantage. Jonathan Taylor does get a score, but otherwise looked bad, and there wasn't space either. And so that part I thought was interesting, where when you have to respect the arm strength and the rushing ability, that there wasn't anything in the way of rushing lanes for Taylor. And again, we'll see how these defenses go forward, but the contrast, and one of the disappointing things as we kind of look to the Texans side, was that Stroud looked amazing again. He did miss a couple of throws that would have changed the game and made it probably not close. But, I mean, Joe Mixon looked like he was running against like a flag football team. Right now, I do want to know, because people know that I'm down on Joe Mixon. He had a huge game. I thought he looked fantastic today. He especially made a play with 7:30 left where there was sort of a shimmy. There was a change of line. And one of the things that Mixon will do, he won't really break tackles for you. He won't create the long runs. he's just not dynamic, but he does, for a big back, have that ability to change his angle as he sees the defender. And so when there is space there, he's pretty effective. One of the things that I would note from like a zero RB perspective is even though Dameon Pierce is a dramatic drop off even from Joe Mixon, who's, the numbers, it doesn't matter what my evaluation is. The numbers would tell you has not been a very good player over the last several years.
It looks like the rushing chart from Next Gen Stats today, and he was, even in a game where he ran for 159 yards, it was like -2 rush yards or expected. He was basically right at expectation because he got 30 carries, and the way that it was blocked out, like you said, there was a lot of room to run. I did think that was notable.
I mean, I'm rooting for him to get tackled, but I'm like, there are no defenders. He's not going to get tackled if there are no defenders around him. But he made some nice plays there. The Texans offense, again, you won't play the Indianapolis Colts every week, but they're going to be running against some really soft fronts.
Before we move completely on from Richardson, the other thing I wanted to say that I think is an issue for him, and I'm not like, it's always tricky to talk about player injuries. He took a bunch of hits again today. And I'm sitting there watching it, even as a guy who hasn't been very in on him. I'm like, protect yourself, man. Like, he got slammed hard to the ground and his helmet came off. His helmet hit the turf. We see those kinds of concussions all the time. He lowered his head on a run and led with his helmet and made helmet-to-helmet contact with the defender on another one. I'm just like, that's something that they should have.
Do you not think he has to do that, though, in order to be the type of weapon that will help them win?
From a player health perspective, I just don't want to see him get another concussion.
Right. No, I mean,
you're probably right. He probably does need to play that way. Yeah.
Well, one of the things, again, not to get us too scattered in terms of games, but Jaden Daniels' helmet wasn't tight enough today and was coming off. And he lost a rushing touchdown because his helmet came off. Some of these things you'd like to think would be taken care of. There are just so many things for an NFL team to address. The logistics of those operations are vast. And they do a fantastic job. One of the things that we saw in Brazil was that when the field wasn't right, the teams basically adjusted and got different cleats, and they still had trouble, but it wasn't anything like the opening 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah. And the big thing, I mean, just to circle back on the Richardson thing, the big thing about him that I do want the takeaway to be, and it sounds like you're very much in agreement, is, I mean, we saw a bunch of electric plays, and that's what you're going to see. I mean, when you get this guy, playing this way in this offense, I think Steichen does such a good job of playing to a skill set. He didn't try to have him throw a bunch of shorter intermediate passes, right? It was vertical passes. It was using the run to set up vertical passes. Only 19 pass attempts. Like we said, big plays, right? That's part of the reason there was only 19 pass attempts, is when they completed them there for 50-yard touchdowns. Like, understanding your players, scheming your scheme to what your players' skill sets are, that's something that good coaches do. I think we've seen that, nothing but that from Shane Steichen so far in his young coaching career, which was awesome to see. On the Texans side,
we do want to talk about different formats as well, and think through how you can take this stuff going forward and be successful. I kind of mentioned that if you have Mitchell and best ball, you're excited. The other thing, though, is that even though probably it's going to be difficult to play in the short term, if you can take the final stat line today, do a 2-for-2 trade in Dynasty where he's kind of on the undercard, and your offer looks good because it's two people who produced in week 1, and you can make that move for him where you get the guy at the, maybe both of your guys produced, only one of your trade partners players produced, but Mitchell is the guy in with that. I think it's a fantastic time to go out and make that acquisition. I think we're going to come to the belief at some point that those two Texas receivers, are really, had they not been competing with each other, and then some other players, that they would have potentially have gone even earlier in the draft.
On the Stroud side, Shawn, I said a tweet at one point today. You're not on Twitter much, so I always like to get your take on takes that I saw be common on social media. I sent a tweet that was basically like, people were saying that Stephon Diggs, or I heard some version of Stephon Diggs is definitely the third best receiver on our team and is not really going to be significant. Like, I can't tell you how many times I heard that. Two touchdowns in the first game. And I especially think the fact that on 4th and goal, they went to him on a first read in the red zone was notable. I probably got sent 15 different versions of the same response, which was, despite their three receivers having 8, 7, and 6 targets, Nico and Tank both had over 100 air yards, and Diggs had like 15. Where are you at on how Diggs was used today, and particularly the lack of downfield passing for him and the downfield passing that was there on Nico and Tank? Does that strike you as a concern? Because basically I got he's going to have to score a ton of touchdowns to matter. And to me, it's like one game air yards data doesn't I'm not that concerned about it personally. I mean, I do think those guys are going to be more vertical and have higher ADOTs. That's would have been what my projections would have said. But Diggs is going to get some air yards at some point too.
One of the things that we know is that, or has been the case in the past, maybe we don't know for this season, is that he dominates at all target depths and can run all types of routes dynamically and is a fantastic vertical receiver. One of the things that seems somewhat likely to happen if they use him that way is that he does lead the team in touchdowns, and he may also lead the team in receptions. One of the things I think was a little bit concerning today, if you did what I did, which is try and draft one of those guys in every league. And again, you're not going to get it in every league because draft conditions aren't going to quite let you. You're not going to reach to the point where you guarantee yourself one in every league, but a very high percentage, right? Part of you is hoping that maybe 2 of those 3 guys win. And in the leagues where you have those players, you do really well. And because you've either drafted 0 RB or you've drafted a style with your receivers that allows you to not actually even need that other person, and that team isn't dead either in redraft, right? Maybe it's hurt pretty badly in best ball, but in redraft, that team can also be successful because you drafted in such a way that you can withstand that miss. My concern over the short term would be that maybe it's too spread. Maybe they kick field goals all the time when they could easily pick up the 4th down. So they actually went for it at the end of the game, which was fantastic. If they had handed off to Joe Mixon and he scored another touchdown, that would have been pretty devastating. Or if they had just kicked a field goal, that would have been extremely frustrating. They played this game very conservatively when you have CJ Stroud. And that was really the thing that we did mention as a possibility. We've talked about in our bold predictions types of shows, and just as you think through the scenarios for the Texans, that an epic season where, and they were talking about it on the telecast today, but the Texans also think all 3 of their guys could get 1,000 receiving yards. But you would love for them to not barely clear that hurdle, especially when it's probably going to be pretty concentrated on them. Maybe not a lot to the backs, probably not really a lot to Dalton Schultz. And you just blow teams out. Much more than being worried about Stephon Diggs' target depth. Because if you're the guy who is counted on in all of the high lever situations and your team knows that you can get open when you need 3 yards, yeah, there are going to be some situations in which that's not great for fantasy, but again, you could have 15 touchdowns when you have CJ Stroud as your QB, and you could have games where those plays start to stack up. And that's one of the things that we did see even in the times when he was not necessarily struggling to get open, but when Josh Allen was struggling or the play caller was struggling for the Bills. So you could have these games where you have 10 catches and you have 45 yards. That's still very playable even without the touchdowns. For me, the concern is that if you're going to hand the ball off to Joe Mixon that many times and you're going to kick field goals when you have 4th and short, you're just not going to have that 5,500 yard, 55 touchdown season.
Yeah,
that we discussed.
I don't think they will. My take, one of my big takeaways broadly this week was, I don't know that every, week 1 has been the same, obviously, throughout the history of fantasy football and those things. We also know that obviously the running back position over time has been shifting toward less workhorses and those types of things. A year ago, a half decade ago, or a decade ago, or really a couple decades ago, when you were first, let's say when you were first running about 0 RB and the landscape that led into that in the decade prior, very different fantasy football landscape, but we knew that there was these like mega workhorse running backs, and the idea was you're leveraging against that. They're going to get used a lot early in the season. A lot of the 0 RB teams are often going to hemorrhage some points early in the year, and they're going to need to kind of build off of that. There's the anti-fragility part where like these teams are going to break down, etc. Part of that is because you can't just give running backs 35 touches every single game necessarily. Some of them can handle it, but Joe Mixon, 30 carries in this game, 3 receptions. Saquon Barkley, 24 and 2. These are new additions onto their new rosters. Josh Jacobs was a new addition, 16 and 2. I think a couple of these teams that went out and got these high-profile stud running backs and want to use them in week 1. And we see that early in the season. But at a certain point, if you're giving him 30 touches a game, something's got to give. Either he's not able to handle it anymore, or you're understanding that that's not the efficient way to play the offense, which I do think if you did this with Mixon every week, I mean, again, he did have a really strong game, and you gave him a lot of compliments. I'd give him some, but I think it was a pretty classic example of the defense was designed to stop CJ Stroud and the weapons, and he had a lot of room to run. His long in this game was a 13-yard carry. He racks up 160 yards, but nothing explosive, really. Nothing like meaningfully elite, just kind of running into space on a lot of it. When he got in close and the field got shrunk, he did end up rushing for 1 TD, but there was a couple that they tried to give to him in close where he just got stuck. I mean, he had nowhere to go. I saw
that happens to all the backs, though.
It does. It does. But I saw some takes from Texans people that part of the reason they brought him in was for the short yardage stuff. And I was just like, you're going to be in for learning about what Joe Mixon is, because fantasy football players will tell you that he's never been particularly efficient in those types of situations.
And I mean, this was a fantastic day for veteran running backs who came into the season with bad peripherals. It doesn't really matter what your take is on that, whether you think it is going to sustain for a month or for half a year or for the whole season. It's not impossible that some of these running backs end up with, win rates, advance rates above the baseline. I guess my concern, I'm not worried about any of those guys beating us in fantasy over even the medium term, much less the long term, which isn't to say they couldn't. But I think
this commenter says Mixon was falling forward all day. He looked great. I just want to say, I think he looked great too. Like I thought this was one of the best versions of Joe Mixon we've ever seen. Sorry.
I mean, there was a gliding element to him that I can't, it's not really appropriate for me to talk about the Bengals since I didn't have a chance to watch that game. But as I'm watching the score swap, and again, I expected the Patriots to be a very difficult defensive matchup, and then especially if you let your players not practice and then come out and play, you're probably not going to look great, right? But this, I think there's a potential that the Bengals hurt Joe Mixon a little bit because the Bengals are just a really weird team. I mean, you can't call them overrated when they almost won a Super Bowl very recently with many of the same cast, but they're a weird team. I really liked how he looked today, but I also think that he's not, these guys are not going to touch the ball that much, exactly as you said.
That's the point.
But as soon as you go down to, they lose, they're going to lose a lot of touches, not just a few touches. They're going to lose a lot of touches. You take 8 to 10 touches off of their plate and give them to the backups. In many cases, the backups are going to be similarly effective because, again, the starters weren't great. And one of the reasons why you and I said, or at least I suggested, that you want to have some exposure to Dalvin Cook, not because that's going to be the right play, but because it's a possible play. Because Dalvin Cook's peripherals are very similar to guys like Saquon Barkley and Josh Jacobs and Joe Mixon. And those guys could score, which they all did. Josh Jacobs was more like a couple fluky plays late, but the other backs look good. Yeah. And Saquon, I said the other night when we were drafting, I think is going to have a fantastic season. There are a lot of situations after the first week where there are fluky types of things, and you want your knowledge of what's happened in the past, and you want your analysis to be robustly evidence-based enough that one performance in the vast majority of cases is not going to dramatically change things. Right. But I think you have to be open to situations where it actually probably does. And so for me, I think that Barkley was always expensive enough that it doesn't really matter where you rank him. Somebody is going to draft him at the 1-2 turn, and then after the points is going to draft him 102, 103. it still ends up being a small win. Now, that's the same thing for everybody drafting in the first round. A player has to go absolutely supernova to be anything other than a small win in the first round. If you get a small win in the first round, you've got a great foundation.
You're in a great spot. Yeah.
Right. So we kind of work through those different types of things. But my concern would be that, I mean, this was a losable game for them, and they need to, the Texans should win this.
That's not how they should win. I was just going to say that.
You need to win this game by 3 touchdowns.
Right. Barkley's a different conversation. For Mixon, it goes back to what we've talked about a lot, where we think over the long term, what ends up winning out is how does the team need to win? Where is their talent? And I think there's no question that Joe Mixon is, the ancillary piece to the CJ Stroud, Nico Collins, Tank Dell, Stephon Diggs show. That is how you win. That is how your team develops and improves and gets better over time. Stroud wasn't perfect in this game. It wasn't the start that we were hoping for, because we have him on so many teams where he came out and just lit the world on fire. That would have been awesome to see. It didn't happen. At the same time, he was plenty good enough. Those guys were all plenty good enough. Nico Collins makes a great catch in double coverage on a vertical pass. Diggs wins on the short routes. I mean,
Collins made a second fantastic catch to essentially seal the game. Right. I mean, one of the things that I've discussed, and I didn't say I thought it was most likely to be the case, but he came into last season with a profile that didn't really suggest that what he did was anything other than like a 99th percentile outcome. And then you think about how good Stroud is. You think about some of the games from Noah Brown. You think about how well Tank Dell played. There's that small possibility that almost all of this is really CJ Stroud. And then you watch Nico Collins make those 2 catches today, just on top of his overall production. And you're like, this dude is unbelievable. He's unbelievable. Right. And we would be saying probably similar things about Tank Dell if Stroud didn't make probably his worst throw of the game when he had him for a 40-yard touchdown.
That's right.
If Dell catches, if that passes a connection, then the people who are saying Stephon Diggs is easily the third receiver are going to be even louder. Yeah. They're like, look at what these other 2 dudes did.
And we saw the Tank play in the preseason as well. Like, you're not worried about Tank Dell if you have Tank Dell. That's where I was kind of getting annoyed, because all I said in my tweet was that people were telling me Diggs was not going to matter. I was definitely not like, then everyone's reply was, well, he is the 3rd best player on the team. And I'm like, well, I'm not really trying to deny that either, because the other 2 guys are really good. They have 3 superstars
at the Pro Bowl, and you're the 3rd best player on your Pro Bowl roster. You're like, well, I'm pretty good still. So
I'm still pretty good at football. Yeah. So the Joe Mixon thing and the Barkley and some of the early running back stuff, I love the way you just said this a minute ago about how our long-term analysis and research and belief and experience, whatever you want to call it, having played this for 20 seasons, I've overcorrected to stuff like this in past seasons. I remember just a few years ago, the name that popped into my mind, probably because we're talking about Houston and it was an acquisition that offseason, but I was fading David Johnson his first year in Houston. In his first game with Houston, he ran 11 times for 77 yards and a TD, caught 3 passes for 32, 109 total yards and a touchdown, 7 yards a carry. And everyone was like, ooh, David Johnson is back. Next game, 3.09 yards per carry. Next game, 1.77. Next 4 games, he goes over 4 once. So 5 of the next 6. Goes on to get injured a little bit later. 691 rushing yards on the whole season. It's a very forgettable year for him. And at the end of the day, we've done this before with veteran running backs. They often look the best early in the season before they wear down a little bit. If that does happen, I'm not saying it's going to happen to all these guys.
It's nice that it does happen, because otherwise ADP would be even more frustrating. We've moved I think you could actually make the opposite case a little bit too, to what we're talking about, is that ADP has moved far enough that there's even potentially an exploitable opportunity for playing some of these guys early and moving on, getting some of the points. It's still tricky to definitively pick, which players you want to be on. I think if you pick the guys who are good, 2 of the names that popped out today, because their peripherals actually are fantastic, and I was excited to see what they would do. And I think we drafted them. Ben, one of the headlines is that our guillotine.
We're not going to get chopped.
We're not going to get chopped.
we were at very big risk of getting chopped, but Aaron Jones, I figured, would be one on this list. We do have him on that guillotine team, so you pivoted right there. I was sorry for talking over you. I get so excited sometimes. I know that the chat's always like, just let Shawn talk. But Aaron Jones was one we needed a big game from to be able to make sure we didn't get chopped in the guillotine, and we got one. Who was the other one?
Connor.
Oh, right. Yeah,
and that'll be probably a full conversation sort of on its own thing. We also then have Cooper Kupp. And so I'm now feeling
we
like
we're never going to get, yeah,
we may be all the way through.
So Cooper Kupp in the third round is like one of the big storylines of today, right? You were in on this like big time, that he flipped Puka at some point this August, and the market didn't necessarily do that. The Puka thing's obviously a bummer. We're not victory lapping anyone get hurt. I'm certainly not. I have a lot of exposure to Puka Nacua. There was something that
we're going to both post massive games if he doesn't get hurt. One of the things, I mean, I want to point out that I do think that there's some nuance, because there's also potentially some hypocrisy with my approach to some of the injured players, where, I mean, when there are guys who are going in round 6, and I think they should be going in round 4, and then they suffer an injury that probably doesn't define their season, and they drop to round 9 or 10, then I'm just like, I'm going to draft them on every team. And if I take a hole, then, you make that up in other ways. When a guy is going at the 1-2 turn and his teammate, when healthy, might be the best receiver in the NFL, it spooks me. I'm not in any way saying that like you should stop drafting Puka Nacua. He could easily have gotten through today with a huge line, right? Because they were going to both put up massive hopes.
Yeah. The point that I was going to say is, like, again, when I said I'm not victory lapping an injury, because I'm certainly not there. I was trying to figure out how I wanted to frame it, but there's a very nuanced point that I tried to make in the offseason a few times, which was that part of what was so shocking about his breakout last year is he didn't run the big routes in college. He never ran more than, I think it's like 250 routes in a collegiate season. And at running back, we talk about how being a workhorse is a skill. And Puka did pick up a few little minor things throughout the season last year, but was typically able to return to the game and not miss too much time. But that was a little bit of a concern, where like he hadn't shown the ability to run massive routes every season in college. Maybe that's part of why his teams weren't using this supremely talented player that he was able to do last year. And I hope that he goes on and has a ton of 500 plus route seasons at the NFL level. But that workhorse is a skill thing we talk about at running back still seemed vaguely relevant with Puka after he got injured in August then as well. That, like, was anyone really that surprised that it got a re-injury in week 1? I mean, I'm just, the injury stuff is obviously, again, really tricky, but it wasn't, I have him in lineups in the main event. Like, I'm not victory lapping an injury, but I also was not surprised that he got knocked out of this game.
I don't think that we even necessarily know. I mean, maybe the chat, who I'm sure is more dialed in to instant news and you may know this better. One of the things that I believe is the case from my initial perusal of some of the news is that I believe that Jordan Addison injured his other ankle today. And that sort of underlines the fact that you don't always know, because if it had been the same ankle, then people would be like, why did you draft somebody who had an ankle injury?
Yeah.
But the fact that it was actually the other ankle and that he was getting open at will and looked, I mean, again, I'm very biased. So anything I say about Jordan Addison is just going to come through those rose-colored glasses. But I mean, he looked uncoverable, and then he gets tackled when they throw a short. Ben, do you sometimes get, I mean, we need them to stack up all of these like 1-point plays, even if you don't go anywhere. But every once in a while, when they throw these passes to your receiver and it's going to go for like 0.8, only because it's a PPR league, or maybe it's going to go for 1.2. You're like, don't get him hurt on that play.
Yeah.
This guy, and you think about all the things that we saw today where very few teams were able to throw the ball down the field. The Vikings, I mean, it seemed very schemed. I didn't think Darnold actually he just doesn't look talented at all. But when you have Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison, and you have a fantastic play caller, and those guys are getting wide open, you can do what he did, which is an incredibly efficient day, until Jordan Addison left. And then they basically just ran the clock out because their opponent was,
but up until that point,
the New York Giants. But
I had in my notes that it was basically just a Jefferson and Addison offense. If you guys saw Jalen Naylor score, TD late Naylor's a guy I was hyping up a little bit and talking about. I am excited about him, but he was not. It was a very much a 1-2 offense. I mean, I was excited about the element that it was so concentrated, but between just Jefferson and Addison up until the point of Addison's injury, I think.
Well, we drafted both of those guys.
That.
Yeah, we drafted both of those guys onto our team last night, and I was thinking to myself, well, we don't have Addison. Well, we may actually have had Addison in the lineup because we didn't want to play a Dunze in the first week, which sadly turned out to be correct. But I'm thinking to myself, if it's just Jordan Addison going out of that game, then we drafted enough players, we're going to be fine. But there was like an amoeba defense around Justin Jefferson as soon as Jordan Addison was out, where you're like, there are only so many players who can cover one guy and have that guy still get open, especially when the quarterback is Sam Darnold.
Yeah, there's 6 dudes on him. You mentioned the Dunze thing. We were started with rookie QBs. I brought up Bo Nix right away, but I meant to go to Caleb as well, obviously. Who was the other one that started today? I guess Jaden Daniels, but was there only 3? Nix, Caleb, and Jaleb Daniels?
Yeah, those were our guys.
Jaden Daniels. Caleb obviously didn't play particularly well. Didn't complete a ton of passes. That was another game where I had the same perception that you kind of let on with the Texans, where I was like, you got to win this game by 2 or 3 touchdowns. How are you trailing? Will Levis didn't look good to me. Had a couple decent throws. He ripped the intermediate throw to Calvin Ridley that was good to see at one point, because the intermediate stuff is kind of the question mark. He's obviously got the big arm downfield and he can throw, some of the short stuff. But then he also makes some really big mistakes that end up actually helping the Bears finally pull the game out at the end. But they were unable to do really anything offensively. I had the, oh crap, Shane Waldron's going to be a huge problem moment watching this game, which we knew could be a problem.
Drive? Because
pretty much the second drive. Yeah. Like pretty much right away. It was like, this is not good. It's just not. I think play callers and schemers, like that's one of the big takeaways from week 1 as well. It's like, and we've talked about this before, the haves and have not offenses, the teams that actually are cutting edge and innovative in what they're doing. I was bummed out by Ryan Grubb in Seattle a little bit as well today. It just didn't go the way that I was really hoping for. I've been worried about the separation. Obviously, I'm a Husky guy. The separation of him and Kalen DeBoer. I've always thought Kalen DeBoer was maybe more the driver. That's why I was a little cautious with Grubb at times this offseason, but also excited because, McDonald went and brought him in intentionally to, hopefully build this modern offense. I don't think they were terrible, and I don't think they're, screwed or anything, but
it is interesting, right? Because you have a lot of these contrasts that I think are fun thematically, where, and one of them is just like directly head to head, where Arthur Smith doesn't do anything for the Steelers that makes you feel like escaping a bad situation with the Falcons was what he needed, but he also didn't do anything so awful that you're like, it was 1000% him, especially then when you contrast it with what the Falcons actually did, where, Kyle Pitts scores because he runs a route and the defense forgets he's on the field. Drake London, he's probably just a guy. That would be pretty disappointing. Bijan Robinson didn't look that great. Now, he still has that eye test thing where you're thinking, okay, and so I say he doesn't look that great at the same time I'm saying, he makes these plays, but you got to make the cuts and go forward. He had a play today, for example, where if you make the cut, you get your foot down, you're going to score, and he doesn't make the cut. Now, the field didn't look great there either.
I got to tell you something from Field Yates that made the rounds on Twitter that you probably won't have heard yet. It made it around Twitter big time. It's got 1 million views. Falcons were in pistol or shotgun on 96% of their snaps today. Out of the 22 snaps out of shotgun, the Falcons had 0 design runs. Out of the 26 snaps out of the pistol, the Falcons ran the ball on 81% of their plays. And everyone's like, why didn't, because Cousins has often actually been an under center quarterback. He does a lot of the drop back game. He does a lot of the play action game. The whole explanation from everybody that this made the rounds on is he's not healthy from his Achilles yet. But also just like, even if he's not healthy, you can't do the pistol and run it every time and the shotgun and not run it every time and not expect an NFL offense to figure that out. So part of the reason they look so terrible and Bijan looks so terrible might be that they were just tipping their plays every single snap.
Well, if you're doing that and you're playing a great defense,
Yeah.
Like, one of the things that's going to be more difficult about evaluating the Falcons is that they're playing a very different defense than, say, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are playing. You could maybe play those two games in reverse and have essentially the exact same outcomes, but just with the Falcons looking great and the Buccaneers looking terrible. So I think we have to keep that in mind. And at the same time, this is one of the reasons why I think the play callers are incredibly important. And yet I think so much of the play calling analysis is, in some ways has to be, but it's something where it becomes most obvious after the fact. And it's heavily built into ADP. And so if you are thinking through those couple of things, there is an element where I think you're forced to still lean into player talent if, after what we've seen in the last couple of years, we know that the play callers are so big. But there's also a thing where the play callers are going to look pretty good when you have great talent. There are some teams like the Lions tonight where if you have worn the other team down because the game has gone on for 4 quarters, and then you want to run David Montgomery up the middle and have high success rate plays and score a touchdown in overtime and win the game because that's the final drive, I think that you can potentially do that. Although, again, part of the reason that seems successful is because it worked. And we can retrospectively say, oh, well, that tactic worked. But the Lions have a real potential problem this year in that every time they hand off to David Montgomery, it runs the clock and it takes the ball out of more explosive players' hands. And then you have a game with the Rams that frankly probably shouldn't have been close go to overtime. And then the offensive coordinator is still praised for having done such a fantastic job because you ran it down the defense's throat in OT and won the game.
Yeah.
I think you have to have some elements to it that are not just hindsight where you're saying, oh, we won the game. It worked. This is a great offensive coordinator. Now, they're a very high scoring offense. We know they're doing lots of things with motion, but you can do all of those things and still look back and be like, you have to get Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta more involved in the game. But that's the reason that we didn't draft those two guys very heavily, is that what happened tonight is something that we thought could happen. I guess as we think about the play callers, and then especially I think the disciples, there's going to always be this element where, I think you want to be excited if you know that the person is not guaranteed to be a retread, but you do need to see them work out there. And the thing I was going to mention in terms of these contrasts again is this element where Shane Waldron goes to the Bears and you're looking at them and you're saying, like, every single problem that DK Metcalf had last season, DJ Moore could have this season. Every single problem that JSN had last season, Rome Odunze could have this season. It would be horrific, but maybe the problems that Geno Smith had last year, Caleb Williams could have this season. The Chicago Bears have far inferior talent at running back. And so what happened to the Seahawks runners could happen at a very exaggerated degree for guys like DeAndre Swift and Khalil Herbert. And Swift was awful in tonight's game. But I do. The contrast with that, though, is that, as you were mentioning with Ryan Grubb, none of those problems actually looked rectified with the Seahawks today in the passing game. And so when you kind of create that contrast, there's no conclusion to then say, oh, as soon as they got him out of there, DK Metcalf and JSN looked awesome, because they didn't. And Geno Smith looked awful tonight. Today.
I think
not awful, but you've got to be able to make some NFL throws. It doesn't seem like he can make.
I think the scheme conversation is really interesting because I do think there's some uniqueness to it that, or some nuance to it that we maybe don't always clarify or hit on. I don't think it's just the play caller or just the individual who gets the credit for being the one who designed the offense or is the play caller or what have you. I think it's also the personnel matched up with that and how that all manifests. What McDaniel's doing down in Miami, we really like, right? Like, we saw a very concentrated passing game again this week. We see Tyreek, we see Waddle. We get that third receiving element with Achane. I was, one of those ones that I was happy to see because I've, made that very specific point that if there was a third guy who developed in the passing game, it was going to be Achane. We saw that in this game. It was hyper concentrated on those three.
The first half, they struggled badly because Malik Washington wasn't available. And when they tried to get it to other players, it was a massive failure.
How do you know that has anything to do with Malik Washington?
Well, he could be good. The other guys that they have are definitely not.
You're like this rookie that hasn't played a game yet. No, I know that he was the missing piece.
The whole point of them targeting that profile was that the players they had, the incumbents on the roster, who are not Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill, who made some fantastic plays. Well, number one, they're not great at getting open, but then their run after the catch is non-existent. And they feel like they would be unstoppable if they had those additional pieces. They were if ETN doesn't have a bad fumble when he'd made a nice run, ETN played a pretty good game, but the headline for him is just going to be he lost the game for him. The Dolphins got dominated in big stretches of this game, but the explosive plays matter, and they were able to pull it out because of that. And Achane looked really good, and Mostert didn't, to the point where we got a surprising amount of Jeff Wilson. So I think the Achane picks
look great,
are set up very nicely. He's going to be a guy. I don't know exactly where we ended up with him. If we both had him, we both had him in the first two rounds. I'm not sure if we both had him in the first round for next year. I feel a little more confident in that after week one because there was such a gap.
I think I had him at 12. And I think you didn't have him in the first round. We talked about him a lot because of that, if that sounds right. So, but what I was going to say is I just saw this comment a little bit ago from Cryath. Waldron's only good year was with Canales, and then Carey here responds, Canales got way too much credit. And I think Canales is a really interesting one because right when I saw that, I saw not necessarily that he got too much credit, but the same sort of thing that Canales didn't look very good today. Canales, you actually have not watched that game, have you? But the Panthers offense, to sum it up, Shawn, looked like the exact way they looked last year, right? Like completely non-functional. Like they're trying to get the ball to the wrong players, all of these types of things. Like Jonathan Mingo is bouncing on his head and stuff at various times. Like, why are you even playing that guy? I don't know. I thought Xavier Legette looked halfway decent. They, tried to get the ball to Deontay Johnson a little bit, but I thought the whole offense, like I was like, wow, this is really disappointing from Dave Canales, who last year, a team that everyone thought was a complete also-ran and nobody wanted to draft was the Bucs, and people thought that Baker was done. He had spent the last year kicking around Carolina and the Rams, and people were really out on Evans. He was going very late and also out on Godwin. And we were like, maybe this offense can be vaguely okay. And the year prior, obviously, the Seahawks with Geno, and Canales had done some good things in those settings. That's why I'm disappointed, is because Canales was able to have a pretty big impact on Tampa last year, it seemed like. He goes to Carolina. I don't know how they could have looked like they didn't do anything in the whole offseason. Like, to me, it looked like Bryce Young did nothing in the whole offseason.
That's kind of going back to Gruden's point there, somebody who definitely knows football in a way that, I certainly don't. But this idea that what he did last year for Tampa Bay was vastly overstated, and that a lot of the things they did in the running game were setting the team up in, very bad down and distance situations, and that they never rectified that. They didn't have any solutions for it. It's a concern, I think, if your quarterback is going to, we've now probably gone to the point in time where the hope for Young is not that he can be someone who carries your team, but if your team carries him, he can be successful.
But should have been able to improve a little bit in that direction, I think, so that he was at least like below average. And again, I know you haven't even had a chance to watch it yet. It was just really disheartening.
I have been in just like a hope-based way thinking that Jamison Williams was the reason that he got drafted number one. And Jared Goff finally was able to not dramatically underthrow him when he got behind the defense today.
Did you see any of the stats from the games you have missed? Because you did reference sort of understanding this game. There's another player that in one of the games you didn't play that you have always really liked that had a fun game, and I just want to tell you about it.
Good. Go ahead.
It's a good thing with it. J.K. Dobbins. Did you hear about him?
Do you look good?
Well, long speed wasn't back, Shawn, but J.K. Dobbins had 2 very long runs and had a 10 for 135 and a touchdown day.
Did he look better or worse than he did when he was playing on the Ravens and he would break into the secondary and then he was flagrantly limping down the field, but would only get caught 60 yards later?
He got ran down from behind on like a 60-yard run, but like straight up from
by
behind.
Someone who came out of the stands, because that feels possible.
No, but he was quick in the hole and he's got good vision. And it was that idea that you've said on the show where, you know, even if he's coming back from an Achilles, like I remember talking to you a little bit about some of the medical stuff. And it was like, well, you know, if this guy's 80% of what he was or whatever, and you're like, well, 80% of J.K. Dobbins is pretty good. Like where the guy's benchmark is matters, I think was the line that you had. You've always been a really big fan of that talent. And even if he was 80% of his real self in this game or 70%, which it did feel like he wasn't quite all the way there, you saw the vision and the quickness and the ability in the whole. And Gus Edwards looked like crap. So,
and I mean, we talk about it obviously because it's fantasy relevant, and sometimes it's frustrating when the teams do stuff that's weird. It bums me out when the guys are having, there were a lot of situations today that were disappointing just for the players because they put so much time and energy into it. And it just is, it's not there.
He had 11 carries and J.K. Dobbins had 10 carries and J.K. Dobbins had 109 more rushing yards.
I mean, run to daylight, right? You don't have to get your broken tackle rate up by finding the first people and plowing into them.
But yeah, let's talk about some more stuff that you did get a chance to see. I thought the Dolphin stuff that you jumped into there was really interesting. HN didn't run particularly efficiently on the stat sheet, but I thought he looked like pretty explosive and he got some like goal line work, which was going to lower the yards per carry, but he ended up scoring.
I don't know again what the bigger story out in the larger world was, because I do like to do my Sundays in the cave with the games. Was he ruled down because like shin ankle was on the ground? Because it didn't seem like replay. The knee was down. It seemed like a really weird. But the great thing is that when you have a small back and they don't score on a short yardage carry, you're thinking, okay, the bigger guy's coming in. That was the shot. And then he scores on the next play. I thought that was huge.
Yeah, they gave him the ball right back. I saw that he got it overturned. I never saw the actual replay, so I don't have an answer for that. I do remember hearing the announcer saying, I had the sound on that game on while I was watching some other screen, trying to figure out if it was going to happen. And the announcer was saying that they thought he went in. And then I was like, oh, he scored.
Well, I think that one was not overturned when I thought it might be. I thought it was fantastic that we got the incredible effort from Gibbs and got the overturn. I mean, these are two guys where kind of drafting into the volume concerns and you're expecting to have to answer questions about that for the first month. Like, why are you drafting a borderline backup? Why are you drafting a non-goal line back? In the Detroit situation, at one point I'm like, I hope that Jahmyr Gibbs is not completely injured, because this has been a lot of David Montgomery to open up the season. But both of those guys in the end looked very, very good.
Another player in this game I want to ask you about, a couple players that we weren't really on. I've basically been like, yeah, they scored a lot of points, but I don't think it matters. This is one that I'm pretty concerned about. He didn't even score that many points, but Brian Thomas looked like he's going to be the entire centerpiece of the Jacksonville passing game. 4 targets, 4 catches, 47 yards, and a TD. One of the things we talked about with Trevor Lawrence and why I liked him this year, in addition to having some low-key better rushing numbers than you would expect, and he only ran once in this game, and he only completed 12 of 21 passes for 162 yards. Again, the Jaguars kind of just gave this game away. They got ahead and didn't do anything, which is unfortunate because they were doing well at that stage of the game and then just played from ahead poorly. Hopefully they learned from that. They were up 17-7 at half. They lose 20-17. Lawrence, part of the reason I liked him is he hasn't had the past TDs. He goes to Thomas twice in the end zone. Thomas draws a DPI from Jalen Ramsey early and sets up the ball on the 1 on a deeper shot, which ETN was able to punch in. And then later he hits Brian Thomas for a touchdown in a way that, I was talking to you about in the offseason. There were some funny Twitter clips of Trevor Lawrence. I think Ian Hardeets from Fantasy Life had a good clip that they of all the drops that Trevor Lawrence had on big plays, right? A lot of potential touchdown passes. Calvin Ridley had a bunch of drops last year.
Ridley is like, I get open. I wish my quarterbacks would make the catches a little bit easier. I mean, Ridley doesn't look like he's going to be startable most of the season, and yet he could have had like a 25-point day today with a decent
he looked pretty solid for Tennessee. But that's part of the issue too, though, is that, number one, his numbers have never consistently been really strong. And you have to factor in that, like, the quarterback matters in that case. That was something that certainly I know I was thinking about with the Ridley fade, was that, like, this is the problem. Like, even if he's not elite, like some people think he is, and then so he's a step down, and then the quarterback's also hurting him, like, quit treating him like he's elite. But Brian Thomas, Shawn, looked like he was in the Ridley role, where you have Gabe Davis as kind of the clear out guy. You still have Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram running around, but Brian Thomas is doing stuff at different depths. We saw a little bit of that in the preseason. He winds up scoring the TD. That was what he was really good at in college. 17 touchdowns last year. I've been concerned about the overall target earning ability. I just thought the usage and the ways that they got him involved in his first career game. They only threw 21 passes. 19 of them were targeted passes. So the top targeted receivers were all at 4 targets. He was one of them. Him, Kirk, and Ingram all got 4. Gabe Davis and ETN got 3. It was pretty spread around. But my point is, it was a low volume thing. So when you see that he only got 4 targets, he had 4 before anyone else. During the game, it was like he was getting stuff early. I always like to talk about like the first 15 plays. What's the team doing early in the game? It just seemed to me like they're like, Brian Thomas is the dude that we're going to get the ball to.
And it's you love to see that for them, because it's a first round pick and they've made a statement with the selection. I mean, they took him ahead of Xavier Worthy, who kind of separately seems like he's almost certainly going to hit. It's interesting because one of the takeaways I thought from today was that Mitchell and Thomas, 2 guys who are a little bit overshadowed and are controversial, in part because they were overshadowed, in part because the incredible athleticism has not necessarily lent itself to big target earning. And so it's the question of, does the athleticism, if you are somehow still not really drawing the targets, is that going to translate when you're not playing against college players, when you're not running wide open because your teammate is even better and drawing coverage, when you're not playing? And we talked a little bit about the Texas quarterback situation probably being questionable. Although my understanding is that they probably played pretty good this weekend. The pretty clear conclusion for me is that those guys are going to be difficult to cover, and that the size athleticism combination is a problem. And that certainly for Brian Thomas, he's your perfect NFL receiver, right? And so, my notes from that portion of the game are similar to what you said, which is that he's open at will, which might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but he was open. And the touchdown was a beautiful play. It really wasn't that tightly contested, and he wasn't that close to the back line, so it probably didn't matter. But his body control as he tapped his toes down there, you're like, he's going to be able to do some of these things.
I had the same impression, and and the way that you say that is right. Like, he didn't really need to be like super precise with it, but also the way that he did it was so smooth that you're like, if he needed to be super precise with it, that's why he scored 17 touchdowns, right? Like, the guys who can score 17 touchdowns in a college season and the guys who can score 12 or whatever, that gap is like, you take advantage of every opportunity that's there. You get these opportunities, you get your toes in on the tough plays. There's a lot of good receivers that can make the good plays or get open and get wide and score or what have you. And then there's the guys that maximize their statistical potential by those types of plays, right? Like, they're always getting that second foot in. He looked really smooth on that. I was like, that's where the after the target efficiency comes in. Had the same takeaway on the toe tap thing. Just looked really, really in control of where he was on the field, which is a good thing to see from a first game of his career.
And these are, some takes where you want to give them, at the same time you want to note that there's a really strong chance that they're wrong.
Right. or not that important. It's like 1 or 2 plays in the whole season or whatever.
Well, I was going to do one of my big bold predictions for you. We're an hour and 9 minutes in. We're probably still going to go for a while because I'm completely wired.
Big one.
But maybe Marvin Harrison and Malik Neighbors like really come for the rest of the rookie receivers in the second half of the season and put up like big time wide receiver 1 numbers, and they just bury the guys who get off to hotter starts. But right now, when you think about especially the quality of the quarterback play, I mean, Worthy and Thomas
are going to beat. Yeah.
I mean, they could have Neighbors and Harrison really gapped by the time those 2 guys get going.
I think everyone watching, including myself, saw where you were going with that. Like Worthy was getting wrapped in there. That was the big bold prediction.
Well, the other thing I wanted to note with Thomas, right, too, is that Christian Kirk had a terrible game. And he dropped, let me see my precise notes here, but he dropped a long 3rd down conversion, which again, we're talking about a game that they should have won. Those 3rd down conversions and keeping that drive alive. They're just so few possessions in an NFL game. Anytime you give one away. Yep. And then later in the game, he had a second, much more difficult play on a 3rd down where he didn't pull the ball in. Now, one of the things that we know is that these long types of scores and drops, it's kind of separate sides of the coin, but those things are not going to be, in most cases, very predictive, although guys who have bad hands are more likely to have seasons where you have an extremely high drop rate, and guys who are explosive are more likely to have seasons where you have a really high long touchdown type of season. But I also think that even if that stuff isn't very sticky, it's especially important for coaches early in the season because you've established something in the mind of the play caller and to an extent the quarterback where they're thinking, okay, this one option that I have looks incredibly dynamic, looks like a game breaker, looks like someone who could carry us to where we want to go, and his teammate blew the game for us. Even if that doesn't really tell you how they're going to perform in practice this week or on the field next week, when we're human beings, when you're doing those types of things, the psychology matters a lot. I think that within the context of the other receivers struggling to an extent, the context of ETN having a signature bad play, it wouldn't be a surprise if the game plan becomes a little more Brian Thomas centric than it was even going to be.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean that my takeaway with the Thomas just doing all this in week 1 was that it's week 1 of his rookie season, and we should expect the usage to grow, which is what you're saying as well. I don't want to. I want to get more of what you want to talk about, but I do want to comment on this. Andrew asked thoughts on the elite tight end production. This was a hot topic on Twitter. There was a ton of commentary that it's basically the same as it always was. I thought tight end was deep this year. I made a point in talking about this. I've talked about this so many times that I don't know why it hasn't sunk in with enough people. I mean, not that everyone listens to me or whatever, but tight end is not arbitrarily deeper or it's not that we're wrong when we say it's deeper than it's not. There are busts. There's busts at every position. This is a onesie position. It's also a low scoring onesie position. So when I talked about it this year, I said there were 7 profiles at the top that were stronger profiles in drafts. And I always made a point to say profiles, not to guarantee that we're going to have more scoring. Often, Shawn, you've heard me do this on Stealing Banana said, some of them are probably going to miss. In the end, you're probably going to have 3 or 4 of them that are actually good. A couple of them get injured. There is a little bit of a higher bust rate at tight end. But because there's only like 7 or 10 good profiles in a given year, there's going to be busts. This happens every year. And people go, well, there were, they lied to us and said it was deep this year, and it's not actually deep. The same thing would happen if there were fewer wide receivers or it wasn't a onesie position or also running backs. There's marginally different bust rates at those different positions. But like, no one ever says that about running back, for example.
Well, I mean, QB also looked deeper. And if you had one of the QBs today that didn't score, you're feeling like you could be in trouble.
Every position is like
because, people you're playing against either directly or the person who looks like they're in great shape to win your league after just 1 week is not in the same boat you're in. And so just that contrast is always going to play up after 1 week.
But then
I think that you have to take it on a player by player basis.
Right. I wanted to talk about the actual players for a sec too. Sorry, I just wanted to finish this thought. It was disappointing, right? And so there are, I think, bad signs on a few of them. And I think where you're going to go with this, and we should talk about some of these players if you want to, but the player by player basis thing is very interesting in part of it. And I do think we are looking at a couple of them looking bad going forward. And maybe that won't even be super easy to, immediately predict. The other part of it, though, is the ways that tight ends do score, even when they're good, they sometimes just have down games like this. And so there's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, a little bit of column C. It's all of that. I was just sort of setting the precedent for, we were expecting some of them to not be perfect every week. Column B is some of them are still going to be good, but they had a down game in week one. Column C is some of them are probably showing us signs that this is not going to be their year. But I think it's all of those things. And it just bugs me whenever it's simplified and it's like, oh, tight end's not deep again. It's like, yeah, no, of course it's not. There were good profiles on draft day. When those don't hit, and that happens at every position, we try to find guys that can replicate it. Those are still no tight end scored. It's not like a lot of good, bad tight end scored. I mean, Isaiah likely scored, but there's not a lot of tight ends that scored.
I do think as high as he went in those post-Thursday drafts, if you told people what the other tight ends were going to score in week one,
he would have went higher. Yeah, right. So but there wasn't a lot of tight end points across the board. And a big part of the elite tight end thing is they're the ones that can give you the spike weeks. They're the ones that can do incredible stuff and start stacking production over multiple weeks.
Yeah, they're going to have still additional bad weeks, but they're going to have a lot of decent weeks, which the bad tight ends don't have. And they're going to have, and they can go on a run like we got from, Sam Laporta really for a big chunk of last season, like we got from Trey McBride in the last 2/3 of last season, certainly like we've gotten from George Kittle at times. Just a couple of years ago, basically every team that had a tournament finals appearance in best ball had Mark Andrews. You can do those types of things from an elite tight end. If you don't have that player, you're simply hoping that your tight end very randomly hits in the week that you need,
or no one scores.
Or no one scores, right?
And I think that's the other takeaway from week one is I just pulled it up, Shawn. Isaiah likely had 26.1 PPR points, but after him, Foster Moreau had 14.3 as the second best tight end. Brock Bowers was third at 11.8. There were two tight ends that had more than 12 PPR points, and Bowers didn't score. There were only 5 tight end touchdowns this week. They were 5 of the top 6 players. 2 of them, my guy Juwan Johnson and Chigo Okonkwo, caught 2 passes, but 2 26-1 and 2 15-1 were good enough tight end lines for tight end 5 and tight end 6 on the week going into Monday Night Football. And Pitts' 3 26-1 was good enough for tight end 4. Again, Brock Bowers at 11.8 was tight end 3. There's no points there. So if next week, Dalton Kincaid, I want to talk about him specifically. If he comes out and has 10 catches next week, he's now the tight end 1, or he's right there with Isaiah Likely, and he's gapping everyone else because there's no points there, right? I mean, that's the point about tight end. The elite tight ends don't have to score like receivers. They can be so much more dynamic than the other players that your league mates have at this position. Just by being,
but I think we
were hoping.
I think we're going to get some scoring though.
Yeah,
right. One of the things is just like you mentioned, a lot of offenses really struggled today, and some of that is going to correct. Maybe not all of it, because some teams have some very real problems that they're not going to be able to snap their fingers and fix. I think there are kind of different kind of sub questions here where if you drafted multiple elite tight ends in FFPC, then one of the things I was going to say, I think you're actually okay in that.
Okay.
Because you have the opportunity to still end up with one of the guys who does score. And I think that you can replace the person
otherwise. Yeah.
I think that if you drafted some teams, a decent number of teams in best ball that are elite tight end, and we continue to have what happened today, that's going to be more problematic.
You're going to be dust. Yeah.
Right. So that
somebody will have the one good one with a late tight end and replace the other good one with a high end receiver or something. And I have a lot of those 2 tight end teams. So that's, yeah. But you're right.
So again, I think that's a potential concern that we have. I still do think it goes back to the individual players on how you're thinking through it. And I guess I'm very frustrated with the guys that I drafted early that I have high hopes for who didn't score today. But with that, one of the things I talked a lot about in terms of I gave him, maybe this is kind of fun, maybe it's just silly, but my piece on the upside mega tiers, this idea of you are wanting to think through upside and you're wanting to think through the tiers maybe a little bit more expansively. But it was a similar type of thing in terms of what you're talking about with the number of guys in that group. I think you always want to be trying to get the tiny amount of leverage that you can, get the best prices that you can. And one of the things that I was really pushing is you have to have a lot of George Kittle and you have to have a lot of Brock Bowers, because there is risk with these plays and these profiles are all pretty similar. You want exposure to most of them. I don't think that you wanted exposure to Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews and probably even Sam Laporta, which is kind of weird because the two guys are the best tight ends of this generation. And then Laporta is one of the greatest rookie tight end ever.
He's the dynasty tight end one, right?
Right. So it seems weird to say you don't want exposure to those guys. I think as soon as next week, you could be saying, man, you needed to have those three guys. We could get a huge bounce back immediately for all three of them. But I think that you wanted to have George Kittle and Brock Bowers because they had as much, if not more, upside than anybody else, and they're cheaper. But then for me, you also wanted to have Dalton Kincaid, Trey McBride, and Kyle Pitts because they were the guys in that group most likely to have a rampage type of season. After 1 week,
doesn't look great.
I think it's much less likely. I mean, it's very clearly much less likely. I think that there's a potential for Kincaid to be just an epic bust.
Yeah. That was a bummer. That was one of the big bummers of this week. And partly because my key stat for tomorrow for stealing signals will be their pass rate over expected. They came out running the ball very, very heavily, not passing at all. But even when they did start to pass a little bit, 18 for 23, a low pass volume game for Buffalo. But they only threw him one pass or two passes. He caught one. That obviously not what we expected.
Now, one of the notes that I have, and I could have read this incorrectly, I do think he was the scheme target on one of the red zone scramble touchdowns for Josh Allen. It was kind of he was leaking out. He's trying to go against the direction they were running, the flow of the remaining portion of the play. But it didn't fool anybody. And Allen watched him do it and then it's like, well, that's going to not work. I'm just going to run for another touchdown. The Bills offense is exclusively just Josh Allen running for touchdowns.
Yeah.
And that's
because he had one called back.
Because he's amazing.
Yeah. He had one called back. He ran for two more. We talked about this stat in the offseason. It's why I had him in his own tier as the QB1. After Joe Brady took over as the OC last year, Allen's rushing TD rate spiked. It seemed to be an intent thing to let him kind of loose in the red zone.
I don't think that it is. I think their offense simply does not work at all now. And the only solution they have is
the opposite of intent.
They did say that we're okay with him treating his body as though every play could be his last. And that's a little bit different than what they came into 2023 with, where they said we want to effectively run a passing offense. But
I think Ken Dorsey got the short end of the stick because he's not allowed to put his franchise quarterback in danger. And then after they're 5-5, they let the new coordinator say, well, no, we'll just let you break your body down, go do it. And then everything worked okay in the red zone because you have Josh Allen capable of running for TDs. But Dorsey had to try to find something that was a different answer. Anyway,
their passing game was so bad today. James Cook, anytime that someone looks demonstrably faster than everybody else, you think that shot out of a cannon phrase, which he did. And yet, similar to their receiving weapons, the offense is not structured in a way that's going to be very good for him, it doesn't seem like. Now, he's so dynamic and they do want to run the ball. So he's someone who could bounce back or get unlocked, unleashed, and have a big season. But when your passing game isn't great. Now, there were some mild silver linings to it, I think, or maybe just positive signs in that Coleman looked okay. It was interesting, Ben, and the listeners will know that one of the things I always get riled up about almost every week, because it's the call that I like the least, is the offensive pass interference when the receiver is held all the way down the field and then they manage to break free of the defender and get called for offensive pass interference on like a 50-yard passing play. You and I have basically no George Pickens this year for a variety of structural reasons. He had one of those games where if he had it like on Thursday night, you'd be trying to decide like, well, I mean, how much enthusiasm do I have for the rest of my lineup? Do I put this one in or not? From a reality perspective, Pickens looked fantastic. He got a big play wiped away on the softest offensive pass interference call that you will ever see. Took a big throw away from him, a big throw away from Justin Fields. The contrast was on the signature play for Coleman today. He just treated the defensive back like a rag doll, and the official watched it and was like, let him play. So we get a little bit of inconsistency on those calls. I thought he looked decent. The Khalil Shakir touchdown was awesome. I don't think he's going to be playable on a good team. And I don't think that he's going to have enough touchdowns like he had today to be a very good best ball piece at his price. I do think he's one of those very good reality role players who could continue to grow into an interesting piece of the puzzle for them. And if somebody in that group breaks out, I do think it will be him. And I think that Josh Allen is good enough that we have to keep that as a possibility. I would like to think that they're going to go back to the drawing room and say, we need to get Dalton Kincaid involved. He's our weapon. We drafted this guy in the first round. We don't want to. And he was fantastic in the second half of last season. You don't have the ADP that he had unless there are a lot of positive signs. But today was bad enough that even with that ADP and the positive signs from last year, I mean, if you had any way to get out of that pick, you would do it.
I think week 2 is going to be huge because I think you're right. We have to see them go back and say, well, for whatever reason, we didn't get the ball into Dalton Kincaid's hands, but we really wanted to and make it a priority in week 2. Because if they don't, then I think the whole thesis is just wrong, like you said. A couple macro points that I do want to bring to the discussion as we're talking through some of these offenses that didn't do a lot. Our guy, Pat Thorman, who you and I have both been buddies with and played in a lot of leagues with for years, works over at ETN and tracks the snaps and pace stuff at a really high level. He said games last year averaged 126.2 combined offensive snaps. That's about 63 plays per game. That's from my projections. I can tell you that was, that's the league average. For each offense, 126, 63 for each offense. And it's not common when you think about like what's actually high and low volume to be more than like 2 or 3 higher or lower. Typically, even just 1 play per game lower, kind of a lot of plays. Like it starts to mean something.
When you're talking about over the course of a season.
Over the course of a season of 17 games, 1 play per game is going to cost you, a decent number of. If you go 2 plays per game, you basically just lost half a game, right? That's 34 plays. That's because the typical team's in the 60s for total play volume, right? So you lost a whole half a game because you were 2 plays per game under the average. The teams that get really low go under 60 plays per game. That's like where Seattle was a couple years ago, and everyone's like, they're so slow. But that's like 4 plays per game under. Just trying to set that stage. He said today featured snap totals of, and he listed them all. Every one of these games was under 120 combined snaps. So under 60 on average. One of the teams maybe went over 60. The other one was under 60. But New England, Cincinnati, 112. The Raiders and Chargers, 113. Jacksonville, Miami was 115. Pittsburgh, Atlanta was 116. Washington, Tampa, Carolina, New Orleans were both 117. Arizona, Buffalo was 118. Minnesota, the Giants, Houston, Indy, and Tennessee, Chicago were all sitting right at 119. This is before the Sunday night game, but only Denver and Seattle at 129. And Dallas and Cleveland at 130 topped the 126 that was the average from last year. So just to reiterate that, the average was 126. All of those other ones I read were under 119 or below, like meaningfully below that, we did have a really weirdly slow-paced week 1, and we talked about this. The other thing, Kevin threw here in the chat, per Steve Palazzolo used to be at PFF. I believe he's now with the 33rd team. They just moved away from PFF, him and his podcast partner, Sam Monson. He wrote touchdown scored. Somebody else questioned him in here. He clarified that was passing TD. In week 1 of 2019, 61 passing TDs. In 2020, there were 52. In 2021, there were 61 again. In 2022, there were 51. So it's 4 years in a row between 51 and 61. Last year, we only had 37 in week 1. Today, or this week, before Monday Night Football, we're at 33. So even if there's 4 passing TDs tomorrow night, we'll just match the 37 from last year. Not great to see in week 1. Last year was a huge drop-off. We're right there again. That's passing TDs, and that is something that I also noted early in the morning games, especially, was that we had all the running backs scoring the touchdowns. I was like, when's a good receiver going to score? The first couple of receiving touchdowns were also like Alec Pierce and ancillary pieces. Finally, we got the Diggs TD, I think was the first one where I was like, there's a fantasy relevant receiver scoring a touchdown. But
I
wasn't just a tight end.
I thought today, which again, I haven't seen this game, but as the scores are popping up, you're like, all of those Rashid Shaheed drafters in the round 11, you're like, boom, right off the bat, long touchdown.
Yeah, that was the other one. Yeah. Shaheed caught a TD right away. Evan Silva talked me into drafting him in our main event. And then we had Zay Flowers, who got the early look, had 11.4 points. We decided this morning to put in Rashid Shaheed to try to get more than 11.4. So I was pumped when he scored right away. I had him in a main event. But yeah, I didn't draft him in any other team. So it was just because Silva really liked him. So shout out to Evan Silva on that one. But yeah, I mean, the play volume being down, the passing TDs being down, Shawn, I do think we saw, well, in some respects, teams trying to find other answers to what defenses are doing. They've spent the offseason thinking about that. And they told us day one, here's what they want to do. The Bills want to run the ball to get defenses out of the looks that they're doing and not allowing Josh Allen to throw downfield. They've told us that with all their offseason moves as well. They get rid of Diggs and Gabe Davis, and they bring in, Ray Davis, and they're clearly moving the offensive coordinator shift. They're moving toward more of a running based thing. I didn't expect it to be this run heavy, but there's a lot of teams that I think we learned today that they want to run the ball effectively to try to force teams out of these, taking away.
But that was the other big takeaway I had is you can't do it. Right, you cannot force them out of it by running the ball. You will simply, there's no way to be effective enough doing that. You're just playing into their hands. Again, depending on where you see yourself in relationship to your current opponent and to the league at large. You're not going to be able to compete with the heavyweights, though, by thinking that you can somehow run these defenses out of the conservative looks. They just wait for you to have a bad running play. They stop your bad quarterback, and then you haven't accomplished anything.
And that's exactly where I was going to go with it. Obviously, you just nailed it. But the whole point of bringing it in all those landscape comments was, I do think we're going to see some teams do the Arthur Smith and just keep running all year. Like you were saying, we got to figure out the teams that are going to actually shift back toward passing a little bit, because then we'll start to see more play volume in those games. Incompletions obviously lead to more passes. Part of the issue is the running and the running clock, and that's why you get the lower play volume. And we'll start to see some pass TDs in those offenses. The whole league didn't look great, but the ones that actually showed some competency passing, like the Texans could have gotten there. They showed enough today that I was like excited, way more so than the Bears, which is another team where we were really excited about. And I'm like, well, they're a couple steps away from being there. Hopefully they have a good game next week and really recalibrate that. But it didn't look good. But we need to find the teams that, as you said, their week one plan is going to quickly modify. And they're going to actually have to do something different, because that's where fun stuff's going to happen in some of the football games going forward, because they're not all going to be under 120 play games. And we're not going to have weeks like Kevin just shared from that Steve stat that are going to be 30 pass TD weeks. We're going to have some weeks coming up where we do have 40 or 50 passing TDs. Who are the offenses that are going to actually move that direction? That's I think the big key to frame as well. The Bills, I think, are a big candidate, because how much can Josh Allen do they really want to do this with Josh Allen the whole season? To have him rush for 7 touchdowns a game?
It's so tough. Again, like you said, you're worried about Anthony Richardson. And Josh Allen took a massive beating today. Now, the reason that he and Jalen Hurts have been this, tier by themselves in fantasy football is because of the rushing touchdowns, but it's also because they've stayed healthy in a way that is probably a little fluky in their favor. And you think about how frustrating Lamar Jackson and Kyler Murray and last year Anthony Richardson. I mean, the teams that are most likely to keep their quarterbacks healthy are the ones who are not running and also are not getting hit in the pocket. You have to avoid both of those different elements. It's one of the reasons why the Chiefs are probably pretty well set, is because you have a quarterback who's not going to be taking hits in any environment. Those are the teams that are going to be the most stable for you as you think through. And the fact that they're stable, and also the fact that you don't take the hits in the pocket, is because of other talent-related things that are also very positive for your scoring of your team. All of those things kind of wrapped together, I think, create a very favorable situation. It's one of the reasons that you suggested drafting Chiefs receivers in all of these drafts. One of the things that I think is interesting, Ben, as you sort of frame that question, is in looking through the notes on the games today, I don't know that there's a lot of reason for immediate optimism, which I think, today was such a fun day, even if some of the games weren't that fun, because we got football, we got to see the guys. You're disappointed in the things you hoped would happen and didn't. You're thrilled about the things that you were excited for that did. But one of the things that jumped out to me today, and you kind of wonder if it will end up having a sustainability element, simply because they were so bad, and they may be getting to a time frame where some of the people involved have jobs and a lot of money on the line. The Cleveland Browns were catastrophically bad, and they reacted to that by aggressively attacking garbage time. And that's not something that we have necessarily seen as much, I don't believe, over the last 4 or 5 years, where it used to be something where one of the things you would really want to target is like, who are the bad teams going to be who don't quit at the end and are stat padding and are deficit minimizing in the fourth quarter? Who are the teams that could actually get off the field on defense in the fourth quarter and then run a bunch of plays themselves?
That's what I hope Carolina would be, after getting so embarrassed by going 1-16 and then didn't even have the number one pick, and another team got the number one pick. I thought they would try really hard when they were down, but they're just too bad at football. But anyway,
looking at the Cleveland Browns, I cannot remember the last time that the thing we talk about jokingly in fantasy football seemed so flagrant, which is if you told me that Kevin Stefanski had maxed entered every single fantasy contest that exists, and that he had Ford on every single one of those rosters, I would believe it after what they did in garbage time today. They got humiliated, and they had their starters out there, including guys who had been to the medical tent like Jerry Jeudy, and were just desperately trying to knock down that margin and to pad the stats of their guys a little bit so they didn't look, when everybody who doesn't have a chance to see the game, and a lot of people will have seen that game because the Dallas Cowboys are very, very high profile, but when you look at the stats, it's simply not going to jump out to you as being as bad as it was, because they kept fighting to get yards, to get that last touchdown. That's something that's interesting, even if it probably doesn't continue. You can't keep putting your starters out there in those situations to get them banged up when there's no actual tactic or there's no objective to accomplish. But man, they really did it today.
They took over with 11:51 left, down 33-10, down 23 points, would have needed 3 touchdowns and two-point conversions. They had a 7-play, 48-yard drive, which is not very strong yardage to play ratio, that ended in an interception in Dallas's territory. And then Dallas had a 3-and-out, and they got the ball back with about 7 minutes left, and we're still down 33-10, and proceeded to do a 15-play, 64-yard, 7-minute drive to score a touchdown and lose 33-17 instead of 33-10.
Where they were just getting the living daylights beaten out of Jerome Ford.
15 times getting tackled. Deshaun Watson scrambled multiple times. Maybe they're trying to get Deshaun Watson hurt. They probably want to get to their backup QB.
I mean, there were a lot of fantasy relevant things that happened in that fourth quarter when they were way down. One of which was that Amari Cooper dropped what would have been a pretty decent length touchdown. And if, you could easily lose one of your games, even if Amari Cooper still has a little bit of a disappointing game, the difference in all those lineups where he gets that touchdown and scores an additional 10, 11 points, maybe 12 points. And obviously a lot of people are going to lose to Ford teams because of all those points in garbage time. As you mentioned, the play volume, but play volume with actual fantasy meaningful players on the field is incredibly important.
Shawn, before I forget, Rachaad White, 15 carries, 31 yards. Bucky Irving, 9 carries, 62 yards. Your thoughts?
Well, they did run a play that had a little bit of misdirection, and he ran to daylight, and he didn't look fast because he, in fact, isn't fast. We know that from the timing and from his drop in the draft. I mean, I'm trying to make the case that it was more balanced than it was. It didn't look very balanced. One guy is a very legitimate NFL starter, and the other one isn't. But the thing with White is that he did add on that receiving value again.
Yep.
And
6
some of those plays were,
yards.
Yeah. I mean, they were some meaningful plays. I think when you have that much value in the receiving game and your team won easily, you've pushed back the time frame one more week before the starter switch, which isn't going to be anything other than making it 60-40 one way to 60-40 the other. The thing that you need to have, though, is that Bucky Irving, if you're going to play him, he needs to be the guy who starts catching the passes.
Yeah.
And even if he ends up as the starter, I mean, White has been good enough. I don't know that he loses that portion of it.
He's good at that. He actually legitimately is a good receiving back. He's a big back that catches the ball in space. He's got that sort of almost, David Johnson. We've always taught he's not as good as David Johnson, in my opinion, because Johnson could do some stuff down the field. But when he gets the swing passes in space, he's going up against a DB, and he doesn't have a whole lot of agility, and he's certainly not good behind a line and a massive offensive lineman. But you get him out in space, he's a big and agile enough back in space against the DB that he'll make a guy miss and he'll go up the sideline for 30 yards. He did it a lot last year too.
He's got good straight line speed. And so when you actually are in space, that will play out.
With a guy that's smaller than you. But when you get him behind the line of scrimmage on any kind of typical handoff, it's just like he just stops. He doesn't even really try to hit a hole. He can't read out holes. I mean,
now he didn't do what DeAndre Swift did once today, which is take 3 steps toward the line, see the defender, and then start retreating as though he was in a rundown at a baseball game.
like my cat when I try to go pet her and she's like, ah. So White did have a 15-yard carry in this game, Shawn. I have to note that. That also means that his other 14 carries went for 16 yards total. Just for people who think that
in a game where every other play the Buccaneers ran went for 30 yards.
Went for a touchdown. Yeah. I mean, Baker Mayfield, 24 of 30, 289, 4 touchdowns, 146 passer rating. Elite stuff there. Godwin looked good. Evans scores 2 touchdowns. McMillan scores the touchdown. Finally, you mentioned you had 2 other opportunities where he got loose and Baker just kind of missed him.
I think that he also created a defensive pass interference in the end zone. This is a game where McMillan legitimately could have scored 3 touchdowns.
Yeah. He looked great. There was something else I wanted to get your thoughts on, a game that we hadn't done yet. What else do you have?
Would you take Jaden Daniels number 1 in rookie drafts if they happen today?
Ooh. I don't think so. Is that wrong?
Oh, I've had Jaden Daniels ranked the highest because I thought he was set up for the best rookie season, which if the guys are close, which really the 4 of them are, then whoever has the best rookie season is most likely going to be number 1, the person who helped you in the season that matters the most right now. And then because of just the scoring, they're likely to be the most expensive the next year. I think that there's a scenario where Williams and the receivers overtake him at some point.
But
I think going back and talking
next year.
Yeah, I think going back and talking about the rookie quarterbacks is still, or certainly him and Caleb Williams is interesting. He looked exactly as advertised, in that the college football experts that I have the pleasure of having on OT and discussing things with from time to time, Travis May, specifically, and a few others have described him as essentially Lamar Jackson, barely down, because no one's Lamar Jackson, but Lamar Jackson with the ability to throw, which is something you don't consistently get from him. You may not consistently get from Anthony Richardson. Probably the two most similar current cases, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, more physical runners, and Anthony Richardson, obviously that mix of physicality and just freakish athleticism. But you have that Lamar Jackson element to it with some ability to throw the ball. Now, we didn't see the ability to throw the ball today, and partly it's because they also have a very weak receiving core and probably a weak coaching staff. But
that's when you asked me the question, I thought he looked good today, and Caleb looked so bad today. But Caleb still, I don't think he has a meaningfully better coaching staff, Daniels. And Caleb still has a better surrounding cast. And so the way that I would expect it to even go the rest of this year is to move toward each other at some point, right? But you asked a dynasty question. If you asked a redraft question, it wouldn't even be close. We were ranking Daniels ahead of Caleb in redraft. But Caleb being the better long-term prospect with the better supporting cast long-term as well, and presumably going to have, I mean, in my head, when you ask that question, I'm like, well, he's going to have a different offensive coordinator next year. Like, I'm already factoring in that the Bears are probably going to be cleaning house, even though they won today. And a lot of people are optimistic they can make a playoff run, but they need to get Eberflus and Waldron out. It's one game.
It's so weird that they did win, because the biggest takeaway I actually had from the entire day was that the Bears franchise needs to fire their coaches now, because every day that passes, you're wasting time. It's very important for the development, not just of Williams, but of Odunze, who was completely invisible in this game. The thing for me with Daniels,
it's like almost the Arthur Smith thing again, where you're like, wow, like, are we going to just go through a whole year of coaches that don't know how to utilize their players? Like, I mean, it's just a
his signature moment in this game was going up to catch a ricochet. You would like to be the actual intended target on the pass that people notice from your performance in the game. But Daniels' actual ability to translate what he did in college as a runner to an NFL football field, which I think is sometimes I think we overstate the questions about if things are going to translate, but certainly, I mean, the Carolina Panthers thought that what Bryce Young did was going to translate a little better, just, globally, obviously. For him to look so at ease and so much faster than the defenders, and to look so smooth and actually it was awkward, but to get down at different times and then to score, really 3 rushing touchdowns. Now, it was a thing where if the second one hadn't been called back, then that would have ended that drive. So it wouldn't have actually been 3. But to have that touchdown called back and then immediately just score again, basically vulturing the touchdown from Brian Robinson, he's in the mix with Hurts and Allen and Anthony Richardson to lead the quarterback position in rushing touchdowns. And he's going to hammer everybody except for Lamar Jackson potentially in rushing yards.
That's right. And that was clear when you did the projections that, Allen and, I mean, Richardson's a little bit of a black box. Like, he could have been there in rushing yards, but Allen and Hurts and those guys rushing yards wide, Kyler, they're not there. It's Lamar, and then Daniels, particularly with the scramble rate. The design run rate is the other half of it, and his was very high last year, and how much they would do the design runs with Richardson. But Daniels' scramble rates were like almost double Richardson's in college, and that matches with the sack rate, and it's just the way that they play quarterback. He's more of a playmaker, and so he's going to end up, and that's the side of it that's on the quarterback. That's a style thing as opposed to the design run is a play calling thing. Daniels' scramble rate through the roof, Lamar Jackson, and then the efficiency on it as well. That was clear in the projection process. It's one of the reasons we were so high on Daniels. And then you add in the touchdowns that you said. I mean, that could be obviously just tremendous. The Bears thing it's just so disheartening. But Yeah, I mean, we're not going to get a firing soon. We're calling for a firing in week 1. Oh, the point that I wanted to riff on that you just said was that idea of things translating college players to the pros, whether the Bryce Young stuff was going to translate. I think that's really the theme of week 1 as well, as like, if we do start to wind down here on this show a little bit, like, what do you want to take away? Like, we're trying to talk about the things that we saw in week 1 that we think this did translate or this didn't translate. When I was bringing up the different coaching stuff, I'm not trying to put Dave Canales in a box, because I really do. I think a lot of it's situational. So some people were saying he's overrated or whatever. I think he did a great job with Tampa last year. What I saw in week 1 is that the Dave Canales thing didn't translate. And like, I don't know how it could now. Like, there was nothing there that looked good to me. I was a Frank Reich apologist at times, and people now think he was just like did the worst coaching job in the league last year. It didn't translate for him either. Some of that got chalked up to David Tepper, maybe, meddling. And like, there was the famous thing where they had a meeting and he wanted him to do more RPOs because David Tepper had heard about RPOs basically, but he's not a football expert. And Frank Reich's response apparently was, I've never had RPOs in my playbook. And that was like a problem for him. He's like, you need to get more RPOs like, you need to figure this out. And Frank Reich's like, okay, well, you hired the wrong guy. Like, I'm not an RPO coach. Like,
this should have come up in the interview if it was going to come up now.
Right. And so maybe that's part of the issue with Dave Canales or whatever. But the point is, we didn't know any of this, really. We watch the preseason, we read the offseason reports, but they're only as good as the beat reporters making them. And also, not to put that on the beat reporters, that also just the fact that sometimes it's not clear at camp and in practice and those things. Week 1, we get to see a lot of stuff, and we get to decide, did any of these narratives that we heard and these things that we thought in our analysis might be true, did any of it translate? And there's a lot of examples of where, yeah, I mean, I think these things do look a certain way. And then there's a lot of examples where it's like, this is not what the upside thesis was. For me, Brian Thomas, he only had 4 catches, but that's exactly what, for somebody who didn't draft a lot of him, I was afraid of. The usage and the efficiency, they're going to scheme him touches and he's going to be good on them. And then he's just going to grow from there. He's a good NFL wide receiver. I would be out trying to buy him right now if I could. I think we're going to see him be strong, right? Then the Panthers is the other side. It didn't translate. What I thought could be good for fantasy wasn't there in week 1. In a game against like the Saints, like, and sometimes these things are just 1 week. We're not being too exact. One that just pops in my head is a few years ago when Aaron Rodgers went down to, I think it was to Tampa, and they got beat like 37-3 in week 1. And he turned around and won the MVP, I'm pretty sure, that year. It was one of these last couple of years where his final years in Green Bay where he won MVP. But the first game, they looked like they were going to have the worst team in football. It can be, okay, we just flip the switch again next week somehow, which is confusing, but that's how football is and how the NFL can be. But what we're trying to take away from week 1 is, what can we be actionable about? What can we act on that we think either the upside theses or the downside theses that we were debating, what was there? What did translate? What didn't? What works? What doesn't work? Because the teams don't even know, man. They go out there with a game plan in week 1 and they're like, wow, my game. You think Dave Canales was betting on everything that he wanted to do not working? I don't think so. I think he was hoping could stack some plays at some point, right?
I'm sure they were more optimistic. It did seem like the reporting out of Carolina was somewhat tepid, that
somewhat melancholy, somewhat reserved.
That they were like, it doesn't look that much better. The one for me that was disappointing, because the team themselves had really promoted it. And I don't think this is necessarily a problem, especially as you're trying to build something and you want to create enthusiasm. You want your players to know you have confidence in them. But there is potentially an element where you want to set realistic expectations for a variety of reasons. The Seahawks were raving about Geno Smith all through the offseason and how he was such a good fit for what they wanted to do. And then we didn't see any of that today. There wasn't a vertical component. There wasn't an innovative component where it looked like the Denver Broncos were ever confused, or that there was something about what they were doing that was creating problems for the defense. The only problem they had. Now, you did get a broken play where Charbonnet scores. And so maybe you can chalk that up to scheme as opposed to simply the defense doing a very poor job. We can't, eliminate that as a possibility. The thing that the Seahawks were able to do as the game moved along, and something they did talk about, was that they want to be a downhill running team and set the passing offense off of that. And Kenneth Walker looked like the best running back in football.
We talked about him a lot, tried to get him in a lot of drafts, didn't get as much of him. We did get him on our final draft last night, right? We got him in the 4th round last night. We finally forced a share, basically, because we weren't getting enough of him. I watched, of the players that I don't have enough of that I watched today, he was definitely one, which is weird because I ranked him RB9 ahead of like Derrick Henry and stuff. But I do a lot of the co-managed stuff. you were the main one that was with me on that, and I mean influenced that rank. Not something where I had a lot of other luck and fortune in pushing him in ranks, but that was one where today, as I was watching, I was like, man, I wish I had more Kenneth Walker in the main event teams.
And a lot of people probably do know this, but he had a second touchdown call back on, again, when you want it to be a score for you, you have a very biased view, but it seemed like a kind of penalty that happens like 5 or 6 times on every single play. And so anytime you lose a touchdown to that, it's a little bit disappointing. But even with that being the case, he's going to score a lot unless the problems that they had otherwise manifest in more serious ways against better teams.
Right. And then they can't run because they can't even throw. And that would be disappointing for Walker. It was rough for the passing game. You mentioned the Charbonnet TD. That was the only TD Geno threw. He also runs for a 34-yard TD on a broken play where he just takes off up the middle of the field. But otherwise, 4.329 for Metcalf, 2.219 for JSN. The actual usage wasn't like scheming them into space in exciting ways. Lockett plays well in this environment, which is, excited to see if you're a Tyler Lockett fan. He's always been good and somebody that we enjoy watching. 7 targets, 6 catches, 77 yards. But it really is one of those things where, like, it wasn't schemed. It seems like Tyler Lockett's kind of making that happen, which he can do in some spots. He's obviously, again, a very talented player. I had a lot of hope for the offense to look better, but also talked through some ways that it might not have been Ryan Grubb. I even joked to you, I know this offseason, that after DeBoer got hired, Grubb interviewed for the job at UW and didn't get the job. And then he wrote a long message to Husky Nation saying, he wished he could have been the head coach and wanted to continue the mission and all of these things. It was in all caps. There's a whole paragraph note, really well written, but just like in all caps. And it's just, maybe he's not the offensive mastermind that I thought he was.
And you're holding it as people who have their caps lock button on? That seems...
It's such a boomer move. I want you to be this innovative, forward-thinking guy. The all caps move.
Sometimes the caps lock is on.
Sometimes the cap lock is on. Hopefully they get that turned around as well. Maybe that was just, Patrick Surtain locking down Metcalf and causing problems. You'd like to think they would have got the ball to Jackson Smith and Jigba more. Really disappointing that he only had the 2 targets and 2 catches. Obviously, somebody we were hoping for in a big way.
That was the most disappointing thing, because you also are just watching what they're doing on offense, and you're thinking they have DK Metcalf, they have JSN. We're going to watch this play develop. We're going to watch Geno Smith drop back, and the combination of routes is going to give the defense trouble. You're going to see him kind of tracking these guys on their routes down the field and uncork something. That didn't happen at any point in the entire game. It's not something where you're thinking, okay, well, this is just a sequencing issue, or the fact that you don't always get the big play, or that sometimes the defense takes a certain thing away. Now, there may have been some elements of that in terms of what he is reading, but there was no room for enthusiasm about what those guys are going to do based on the play calls and how those guys are running their route combinations. There's just there was nothing there.
We were talking about the tight end, Shawn. There were 2 tight ends today that had more than 5 targets and more than 4 catches, 5+ catches, 6+ targets. Who are those 2 tight ends? Can you name them?
I'm sorry, say it again.
There were 2 tight ends today that had more than 5 targets, 6+ targets, and more than 4 receptions, 5+ receptions.
Well, you had said that one of them was Bowers, right?
Yeah, one of them was your favorite tight end, Brock Bowers. The other one was my favorite tight end, Trey McBride. Just throwing that out there. Or also your favorite tight end, Trey McBride.
So,
but he only had 30 yards. 9 targets, 5 catches, 30 yards for McBride today.
This is one where, and again, you do, regardless of what we come in with as a thesis for the plays, you can end up with disappointing games where you're like, this is going to be fine, and disappointing games where you're thinking, I'm going to have to really see something before I could ever put JSN in a lineup again. Trey McBride, my only concern there is like how bad Kyler Murray is. And I know that's not an opinion that's shared by that many people, in part because his numbers frequently look very good. The numbers almost always tell the tale, as opposed to some random person watching television thinking this should somehow be better. So I want to stipulate that. But if you're an Arizona Cardinals fan, you generally do not share the overall community's enthusiasm about what he brings to the table as a passer. And today he looked like a faster, but overall much weaker version of peak Russell Wilson. In that when his guys would come wide open on the initial reads, he simply could not see them. On the possession where Michael Wilson scores the touchdown early, I believe, it was obvious to me because I was tracking where Trey McBride would go, but then also there were multiple replays showing how Trey McBride had run into the end zone and turned around with no one near him, and Kyler Murray just simply couldn't see it. A couple plays later, he runs a corner route to the back pylon, wide open. Kyler Murray can't see it. Trey McBride was wide open this entire game. And so for me, it's a thing where I'm not a Kyler Murray believer. The shares that I have in him are the ones where they're like a round and a half below ADP because he's going to run the ball.
With Trey McBride.
They've got Marvin Harrison, right?
Yeah.
You're thinking like maybe that will matter. Although the first target today to Marvin Harrison, they were not on the same page. I don't know if that was Murray or Harrison. The second one is a bad drop. Harrison doesn't seem like he's that close to contributing. But again, the first week can be incredibly misleading. I hope it's misleading for him as well. But Trey McBride was wide open. And so I guess I wouldn't be very nervous about him. If you could go out and get Trey McBride in any type of format, I would do it.
I was just going to close everything you just said. I agreed with, and I was going to close by saying that everyone's saying the tight ends were all down, but the McBride stuff to me was actually fine. 9 targets. The usage was there. You're talking about how open he was in the end zone multiple times. I didn't notice that, but that even made me feel better. But when I transitioned to it, I was intending for us to say that it's not as bad as it looks for him. 9 targets, 5 catches, all that stuff. We're all really we're both very concerned about Kincaid, for example. If you could make a trade this week where you end up doing the 2 for 2 and just swapping those tight ends, and it seems like the other side of the deal is the important part of the deal. That's the important part of the deal. Like, I would love for you guys to get into McBride from Kincaid. We've both loved both those guys around here, but the teams where I have McBride, I'm not concerned at all. I'm like, yeah, I feel like I got the tight end one correct. I feel like we're gonna see that build in a very positive way. Again, 9 targets is a very meaningful number. Only 3 tight ends on the week and 2 today. Isaiah Likely being the other had more than 5 targets. So big for him. Bowers was one of the other ones with 6 for 58. I think you got to be really excited about all those Bowers shares too. What did you mention that? Did you see the replay of the Marvin Harrison running wide open one?
No, I don't think that I did.
That one made the round on Twitter. You'll have to Google that afterward. He got cut loose in the later part of the game when they needed a touchdown. Got completely cut loose. The corner let him go, and the safety wasn't over the top. and Kyler
Kyler
bailed
wasn't
out of the
reading
pocket.
anything today, Ben. He looked terrible. Now, again, he's been good enough in the past from a variety of different metrics. He's got the ability to extend the plays. I mean, but that's my concern for players who are really dynamic with their route running. It's one of the reasons why I basically have zero Marvin Harrison, is just when the game was on the line, he threw the ball up to like a double covered Greg Dortch. And we know that Dortch has been generating very positive reviews. And he was the receiver that was being looked to. Wilson had the touchdown, but also had a really bad drop. There doesn't seem like there's any volume scenario for him. Again, maybe they really shift things around because the offense was that bad. The game looks a little bit weird, in part because in the first half, James Conner was running through the Bills defense like they weren't there. And then they also had a special teams touchdown. The special teams touchdowns can also limit your ability to have drives and plays. You score, but your defense is immediately back out there on the field. You would obviously always take those points, but when you're trying to get in a rhythm, establish some things, you lose some of that when the offense loses plays and it's just on the sideline forever. The structure of the passing game today was very poor, and Kyler Murray was not seeing his guys open.
I got to ask you about Neighbors as well. That's one of the games that I was having some technical issues with and did not get to see a lot of early. I wound up seeing a decent amount of Jefferson, Aaron Jones, and the Vikings. And I felt like I saw a lot of Wandale, who had 12 targets, 6 catches. I felt like I didn't see much of Neighbors at all. I looked at the box score about halfway through the games. I was like, does Neighbors have a catch? And he had 2. And I was like, oh, hey, cool. Because I hadn't seen him. Finishes 7-5, 66. I don't think I saw him catch a pass today. I just want to know what you saw from him.
I mean, he looked good. The concern is just that from a team-wide perspective, they have a lot of problems there. Ben, what were the target numbers for Devin Singletary?
5, 4 catches, 15 yards. 3 more for Tyrone Tracy, 1 more for Eric Gray. So 9 to the backs.
And sometimes we like that, right? But there was a lot of scheme stuff today to Singletary in a role that he's not even been that good at. I mean, I'm a huge Devin Singletary fan. He's not a great receiver. You don't want to be heavily involving him as a receiver. There were a lot of designed runs for Daniel Jones, which was encouraging from a fantasy perspective if he doesn't get benched soon, but was also weird coming off of the injury elements that he's dealing with. Partly it's just an awareness of the fact that they don't have things that they do well offensively. And so if your quarterback does have some scrambling ability, you're trying to do anything you can to create a successful play. Neighbors was much more involved than Harrison. When you think about those two guys side by side, even though that's not really what anybody has to do when they're thinking through their fantasy teams. And he did look good. He's extremely athletic, which everyone knows. He's one of these players where just immediately he looks larger than life, even out there with NFL players. But the offensive context was as bad as all of if not worse than what the actual stat line looks like.
Talk about the translating things. 20 months ago, these teams met in Minnesota. The Vikings were being talked about as a team whose win-loss record was fluky. They met the first round of the playoffs. The Giants came in to Minnesota and upset the Vikings. Brian Daboll looked like the offensive mastermind that had gotten a Daniel Jones offense to be functional. Kevin O'Connell was good in that first year, but maybe not great. In the 20-month sense, O'Connell looked really good last year, given that he lost Kirk Cousins and some of the things he was able to do with Nick Mullins and some of that, and lost Justin Jefferson as well. Daboll looked a lot worse. We were hopeful that the Giants might rebound. They opened this season in New York this time. Minnesota, now the road team, they go into New York and absolutely dominate. I think we have a really wide gap there. I've been an apologist for Brian Daboll for the last 20 months or so. as he's struggled over the last year. I don't know if it's just Daniel Jones or what have you, but like you're talking about some of the scheme related stuff there. I mean, Kevin O'Connell was able to get Sam Darnold some looks that made Sam Darnold look like a Pro Bowl quarterback. And if you can do that with Sam Darnold, as you know, even as Jordan Addison's getting hurt in some of those things, I think very promising for the Vikings that they have a coach that can do some of those things, even though they're, you know, on the lower end of the talent spectrum. But as we were talking through scheme and coaching and how these things manifest, I had skepticism about Sam Darnold. I think you definitely have to think of Kevin O'Connell as somebody who's going to elevate his talent, which is exciting.
It is. There was one point today when they were really humming where I was thinking about my comment just last night that, you know, he would be like in the very best case scenario, he would be Tua, but with even a lower weekly ceiling that didn't allow you to win fantasy games. And I was like, maybe that's wrong. I mean, maybe they could keep it going. Maybe they will keep it going in games where you're playing a competent opponent. I don't know that they had that much in the way of options once Addison went out. I think that's a really important injury for them. They're one of the teams, and again, this is baked in on the TJ Hawkinson side, but when you think about what they would be if they had all the players who are big names on their roster versus what they actually are, they've been hit very hard by injuries. I think it'll be difficult to keep it going. But the thing we sort of started the show with and kind of wrapping back around, Aaron Jones looked like, you know, peak Aaron Jones. And so that also gives you a complementary piece where we talked about how you can't run these teams out of their defenses either. And I'm not saying that a team is going to necessarily change the defense to try and stop Aaron Jones, but Aaron Jones is so explosive on a per play basis that when the defense is giving you that, he will take chunks, not 6 or 7 yards, but 15 or 20 yards. And you can move down pretty quickly like that.
We are going to have to wrap up here pretty quick, Shawn, because I got to get some sleep. I got a whole day of writing tomorrow. I'm sure you do as well. I do want to – there's a couple games we haven't hit on yet, or a couple teams. We talked about the Browns, but we didn't really talk about the Cowboys on the other side of that. We didn't talk about Pittsburgh, Atlanta. I think we should talk about Fields a little. We talked about Atlanta. We didn't talk about Fields necessarily. We talked about Pickens a little. I wanted to get your thoughts on Fields. Yeah, the Atlanta stuff was disheartening, but I mentioned to you that I think there was some really weird formational stuff there, and who knows what, you know, if they were sort of tipping that stuff off. I mean, it's just not a good sign also for a first-time coordinator to be doing that. But I want to go to Dallas because in Dallas we got in Cleveland, but for Dallas we got Dak didn't even throw for 200 yards. Zeke played heavily over Rico Dowdle and was actually more efficient than Rico Dowdle, and I thought looked maybe even a little bit better. Jalen Tolbert did nothing. Somebody that I've been really hopeful for, and you wrote up as well. Jalen Brooks actually made a nice 18-yard catch. Who's the other guy that people were talking about for that role? And I thought Brandon Cooks looked half decent, which his numbers really cratered last year, but he looked back a little bit today to me. Lamb goes 10, 5, 61. Cooks catches 4 for 40 in a TD. Tolbert only has the one catch. Ferguson gets hurt, which hopefully is nothing, but they're going to do an MRI. They think that the ACL is intact, but the way that he got helped off and everything, it seemed like at best case scenario, he's probably missing a few weeks, right? Like kind of like the Jordan Love thing to my eye. This is like a shallow team. I mean, the Cooks thing is good, but if Tolbert's not going to be anything, if Dowdle's not going to be anything, if these guys that hadn't bet anything, but they were counting on breaking out in year 3 or 4 or whatever, actually can't do that, which is, you know, something that we were concerned about with some of these players. You're relying on Zeke. You're relying on Lamb, obviously, but then what? Brandon Cooks? They win this game going away, and they score 33 points against a Browns defense that's good, but I think in part because the Browns offense was just so non-functional. I left this game kind of concerned. I mean, they're a team that schemes well as well. I think Mike McCarthy's a good coach. They showed that all last season, but man, like, where's the production and the yardage and all that going to come from in this offense?
This is one of those teams that always low-key terrifies me because we tend to draft very heavily on sort of long-term talent. And the Cowboys don't have people who fit that other than CeeDee Lamb. But there's the potential for it to be such a large pie offense. And there is no competition from teammates, right? And at some point, you're like, someone's going to fall into what, Jake Ferguson did in the playoffs. Someone's going to fall more consistently into what Brandon Cooks did today. Someone's going to fall into the running back points, because the running back points really should come in a more similar fashion to what we saw with Joe Mixon and the Texans today. Not necessarily identical, but it's with Dak Prescott and with CeeDee Lamb and a competent offensive coordinator and a defense that a decent chunk of the time is going to put you out on the field over and over. My note for this game, Ben, is actually, should we have considered Brandon Aubrey in round 5?
Yeah, I mean, probably. Although I will note, as I was talking through that, as you were replying, I went and looked it up, because I'm like, where were their yards? And they weren't there. The Browns had 230 total yards. You mentioned a lot of that was very late, but 230 is bad still. The Cowboys only had 265 in this game. They scored 33 points. I go to the play-by-play. In the first half, they have an 80 or 70-yard touchdown drive, and then a bunch of other punts, and then a 78-yard touchdown drive, and then right after halftime, they had their third touchdown was that punt return TD. Kevontae Turpin ran back a punt in this game. Their 33 points was 3 touchdowns and the 4 field goals that you're referencing. Their field goal drives, Shawn, come after a bad punt, an interception, and 2 turnovers on downs, probably.
I think they're all correct.
Okay. The length of those 4 field goal drives were 17 yards, 1 yard, 14 yards, and 10 yards. None of them were more than 20 yards downfield before they got into field goal range, because the Browns were not pushing them back or anything. They really had 2 touchdown drives in this game, and in a 33-point game. They didn't even have 300 total yards.
So some of what happens is just that's the bizarre type of game that happens when your opposing defense is that good. The Cleveland Browns can actually stop you. So as a fantasy manager, the part that terrifies me is that I don't have much exposure to non-CD Cowboys, because they don't have players who are good enough to have exposure to at their prices, which in many of the cases, the prices are not that expensive. And yet it's still more than you would want to pay, because there is still an opportunity cost. One of the reasons that I've got a ton of Tolbert is that basically free
costs. Yeah.
And they talk
like Dowdle, you have to not take a running back that we actually want to be taking.
So it's disappointing when you have a bunch of Tolbert to watch this game and be like, it's a lot harder now to see it. And it is a different scenario when you're discussing players who are established members of a team with a coaching staff and a QB over previous seasons, as opposed to rookies with new situations and new coaches and all of that. The numbers for Neighbors and Harrison today were pretty traumatic for people who were playing them and are in a position where they're going to need them to score. But there are lots of explanations for why that would happen. You still expect them to score. Now, their prices, again, are very different. But Jalen Tolbert is one where I feel like I just can get off right away. It doesn't mean he's not going to have some games later in the season where he scores, but I'm no longer thinking that that is super realistic or something that you want to play through. But the thing that is going to be a continual source of anxiety is that someone is going to score points out of this offense. There is just simply too much there. Those points are in some way, shape, or form going to be scored against you. But for at least one game, anybody who doesn't have a lot of Cowboys dodged a bullet. Because there was this move on the price of Dowdle and Elliott as we went over the last couple of weeks, it started to get to the point where it was really hard for me to not take some Ezekiel Elliott shares. because he was being talked about as the passing down back.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't actually think he was going to get too many goal line carries, and I wouldn't be surprised if that ends up being Dowdle. One of the things I would say if you're on Rico is that I don't think that you should necessarily panic. This was a bad start, but the offense is going to score a ton of points, and it's still very possible that Elliott is bad enough over the next 2 or 3 weeks that it has to more or less be Dowdle.
Yeah, because there's no.
I do think there's still a pretty realistic possibility that it ends up being someone like Dalvin Cook.
Yeah.
I mean, points are going to be scored here. I think that CeeDee Lamb.
Rico will have to fail for Dalvin to get his chance, is sort of what I was thinking, because he was inactive here today. Anyway.
So I guess to kind of finish that thought that I got started and didn't really follow through with was that Elliott is actually a little bit of a concern now because people got him so inexpensively, and it does seem like he may score some points.
Yeah. It does seem possible. I didn't think he looked great, but I didn't think he looked terrible. I did see some people talking about how he wasn't as bad last year, and I mean the peripherals say he was pretty poor, but he caught both his passes today. He did score a short yardage TD. If he gets short yardage work and pass down work, and you're getting high value touches, and you're playing a lot on an offense that's going to play fast and score a lot of points, like you said. I mean, yeah, I talked about the Cowboys not doing a lot, but it is a very valid point. The Browns defense is incredibly difficult. I guess I expected to see more yardage when I dug into this box score, given they scored 33 points and were ahead all game. But it's just a matter of they won through the Browns offense being inept, and then also the Browns defense is good. And so those things are going to lead to a box score that looks like this.
I mean, as you mentioned with Elliott, SIS has different numbers than say Next Gen, different numbers than say PFF. It's interesting sometimes when the numbers disagree. SIS basically had him as the worst running back outside of Kareem Hunt. And so
I thought you were going to say there was something optimistic there. But
no, I think that the eye test would actually tell you that he didn't look as bad last year with New England as he had previously with the Cowboys. But that's not what the data would indicate. And so that's the kind of final nail in the coffin where it's like round 13 and he's fallen a round and a half below ADP. And you're like, at ADP, it's actually a decent play. But even in round 13, there's someone else that you want to be on because in the second half of the season, it will probably matter more.
Right.
But you don't know for sure because the Cowboys could score so many points. In this game, I do want to note that CeeDee Lamb is going to have a massive season, and they were scheming a lot of things to him, even in a game where probably the thing that made the most sense for a guy who has had the contract thing would be to get him off the field as well.
Yep.
I was watching this game thinking everybody should be off the field. This game has been over for a long time. Why would you? The thing that drives me crazy is the teams don't play in the preseason and are not ready for week 1, and they look like they haven't practiced. And then because it's a real game, even when there is a 3-touchdown margin, you have players that matter out on the field. Those guys shouldn't be on the field. Now, we wanted to be on the field for fantasy, but they shouldn't be on the field. CeeDee Lamb got open deep in this game, and Prescott didn't deliver the ball on time, and it got knocked away. There was the potential for Lamb to have actually had a very big game this week right away.
What about Fields? What did you think about him? I thought he was mobile enough. I thought his passing was maybe not where I want it to be. It wasn't bad or anything. I mean, throws for 156 yards on only 23 attempts. I mean, really, that's the big part of it is they're not going to call enough passes. He's going to scramble sometimes. They run 41 rushing plays in the end. Again, some of that's because of his scrambles and only 23 passing plays in this game. They win 18-10, only 6 field goals, no touchdowns.
How did the running backs split out?
Meaningfully better for Najee. Warren, I haven't seen the actual stat share stuff. What I put in my notes is that Warren, and I could find it real quick, but that Warren seemed to be playing on pass downs a little more, but I only see the 2 catches here. But like a little bit more of a traditional like rusher and passer. Najee 20 carries, Warren 2. I mean, that was surprising to me, even though he did have the hamstring. 20 for 70 yards with Najee. He did have a 20-yard run in there. The other 19 go for 50 yards. I mean, he looked not great to me. He had 1 catch as well for 9 yards. Warren's got to be more involved, right?
I just wanted to verify that what I was seeing and what I had down was in fact the case, because you could not find him in the running game. And there was some very high leverage play toward the end where it was a Cordero Patterson touch.
So my old coworker at CBS, Dave Richard, always does a thread of running back snaps and stuff on Sunday night from whatever his data source is. And he's got, for the Pittsburgh-Atlanta game, Najee 58% of the snaps, Warren 29%, so half. Cordero 14%. He did note that Warren played on 8 of 17 third downs, so like almost half of them, while he played a third of the snaps between him and Najee. But then the fact that Cordero's taking 14% is annoying as well. I wonder if it was health related, but
I think it has to be a little bit, but this has been my concern for Warren this season. It's one of the reasons why he's someone that I've been so unsure about, which is that there's no question that if it comes to ferocious running, that he is the current version of like a Marshawn Lynch, right? He's better than Lynch because he actually makes yards after he breaks those tackles. But the passing game was a big part of what he did last year. And even if you were out there for those plays with these two potential quarterbacks, you're in deep trouble if you need the value to come via that route. I thought the Fields looked really good. It's really good that does destroy any other weapons in the game. Now, he had a nice rapport with Pickens. I think that Fields is a little bit better for Pickens than Russell Wilson would be, simply because Fields can throw the ball. I mean, you look at what DJ Moore and Cole Kmet were able to do last year, and the problems that Fields has as a reality player don't necessarily mean that he can't unlock a good weapon. The thing that really jumped out in this game, if you like Fields and if you like Pickens and if you like Najee Harris and you don't think that the problems are Arthur Smith, is just like how much they needed that Brandon Ayuk trade, because outside of Pickens, their receiving weapons are extremely weak. And so it's somewhat similar to the story with Jaden Daniels, where you are wondering where any like true passing volume could come from, because there just isn't anybody else to catch the passes. Now, on the Daniels one today, when McLaurin did actually get open deep once, Daniels missed it. That even just that play, if it hits, is not going to be enough for Terry McLaurin actually to be playable. But the problem that they have is they don't have anybody beyond that. The Steelers don't have anybody beyond Pickens. So it makes it difficult as you're designing plays, because the defense, knows what they have to take away. I thought within that context, Fields looked really good. My concern, or the thing I would like to see, is a little bit more of the scrambling, the rushing dynamism that we got a couple of years ago, where just every time he took off, you thought he was going to go 70 yards. Yeah. He didn't exactly look like that today. He looked fine. The passing looked good.
Yeah, the Pickens thing, to me, I noted he looked incredible. I thought their connection looked incredible. He's the type of receiver that works with Fields, because Fields is very accurate to the deep, intermediate, and downfield areas, and that's where Pickens can win. And I wrote in my notes he's a big play waiting to happen, but it's just going to be tough with pass fall. He winds up with 7 targets on 23 attempts. It's going to be a really strong target rate, right? That's almost 30%. 6 catches, 85 yards, but that's in a game where he dominated. I mean, he dominated. You get 6
if you dominate and score 14 points.
That's tough. That's tough. It's just because
some of those games are going to come with touchdowns.
Yeah.
And so in those weeks, you're okay.
Yeah. And he'll have an interruption or two with 2 long touchdowns in those games, which will be nice too. But there's going to be some games.
He absolutely dominated, and it's not even something that necessarily moves the needle that much for your fantasy team.
You look at it in the game, in the box score, and you're like, how did that not even get to 100 yards? Like, that's crazy. Anything else you have in your notes there that you really wanted to capture before we let these people go?
I think that is the majority of it. There's more to talk about, I think, with the Bears, but we did
Well, let's talk about it for a second.
What are you thinking
I do.
with? Do you think you can start any of those guys next week?
Terrified.
I mean, DJ Moore looked good, but not in a way that you feel like it's going to be fantasy relevant. I would note in Caleb Williams' behalf that the player we have trumpeted as being someone who is still relevant and is coming off a fantastic season and actually looks his normal size, not 300 pounds, dropped a touchdown.
Fat Keenan, yeah, I should have caught that. I tweeted that he had too much grease on his hands, Shawn.
Him and me as well. I'm doing all of these with the old hamburger wrappers. Yeah, he's got to make that catch. He's going to catch that 98 times out of 100. Williams had a ton of tip passes today, which was a bit odd because the defensive line is visible. The trajectory on the passes was just through defenders. Those plays are going to never work. The cool part was that early in the game, he had the play that was very similar to the preseason. And we talked about how some of the things that Bo Nix did in the preseason weren't going to translate directly because the teams are playing real defense. Similar things with Caleb Williams today, but he had one of those rollout throws where he hits DJ Moore on the move, and there are only 2 or 3 quarterbacks in the NFL who can make that throw.
There's only 2 or 3 that can throw a ball that hard standing still. He's throwing on the run. That was a bullet.
But there were about 10 low arm angle through the defensive line passes that just should never happen when you have that arm talent and when you have those receivers. And it was, again, just so much in the way of flashback to last year with the Seahawks where you would watch the play develop, but there's nobody open. It's not even necessarily on him. The route combinations have to be getting people open down the sideline, open in the splash zone area. People have to be open. When you have those 3 guys, it just has to look very, very different. And I think that it will. And yet when you're starting from such a low baseline, looking better doesn't get you where you need to be for fantasy until you've taken multiple steps. They're not 1 step away. I mean, is Caleb Williams someone who is playable next week?
It feels like a problem. I don't know if he is. I think I think in most formats, he's a cheap enough quarterback that you're either thinking of second quarterback or people in Superflex are probably going to have to start him. They're playing the Texans next week. I just checked. Obviously, the Texans secondary had some leaks today. Anthony Richardson was able to hit some long TDs, and then also they're back at home. They were playing in Indy. I would expect Stroud to look really good next week. The Bears defense, I think, is good, but then that might push the Bears back a little bit. But I think the big issue, so Caleb Williams, the stats are 14-29, sub 50% pass completion percentage, 93 yards, 3.2 yards per attempt. We didn't even get to 100 pass yards in this game. No TDs. You mentioned the drop touchdown from Keenan. The concern for me was what you said. He has a really good throw on the run. We know he's a playmaker. He had a really nice throw in preseason rolling out to his left where he hit a Dunze. But if he has to make every one of his plays rolling out of the pocket because they can't scheme an offense where he can throw it, find guys open from the pocket. I got to feel like I was kind of thinking about it during the game, he's back there and he's like, man, this is not what it felt like playing in Lincoln Riley offense, who schemes stuff up where he gets, Caleb Williams was very efficient playing for him, but back when Lincoln Riley was in Oklahoma, you had Kyler Murray there and you had Baker Mayfield there, and those guys had some of the most efficient college seasons of all time. He's able to scheme things to get guys into space, and it's helped his quarterbacks, and his quarterbacks have gone on to be number 1 overall picks 3 times now, I guess, Lincoln Riley, right? If I'm not mistaken. I think he coached Baker and Kyler and then now Caleb.
And frankly, those players have had some issues.
Some troubles. And I wonder if he's in the pocket standing there going, this is not the offense that I used to get a play in, right? Now I have to deal with I don't even know. It's hard to explain or think through, but route combinations they're not complex. If you ever played Madden or played video games or whatever, you understand the idea is to get receivers into different areas of the field and space them out and layer them. And there's timing elements. This guy runs through this area to pull a safety, and then another guy, winds up in that area. Outside guy runs some kind of post, slot guy runs some kind of out. It's not that simple. They're doing a lot more complex stuff with it. But if your route combinations aren't layering, and if you're not doing certain things, and then the way the progression is built into the route concepts, it is complicated as well. It's not difficult, but it's also not easy. And you get the impression with Waldron and some of these coaches that really struggle with it. It's not just Caleb Williams. There's a lot. I mean, this is part of the reason I was kind of high on Kyler Murray this year, Shawn, when you were talking about him earlier, was like, I never thought Cliff Kingsbury was particularly good at this element of it either. But yeah, I mean, we don't get to see everything that he's reading out. Sometimes I'll show a replay and go, look, no one's open or what have you, But really, the feel you get is when the quarterback's never comfortable and the guy that he's supposed to be going to isn't open. Like, that's what we hoped with the Ryan Grubb stuff, with the Geno Smith stuff, was that Michael Penix at UW a lot, he got to throw to his first read. The stuff that they did and the motions and the ways that they use their formations got the first read open so often that you could throw on time. You were never under pressure. You had a really low sack rate, all of those things at UW last year. We didn't see that with Seattle today either, which was a problem. And that's why I had an issue with Seattle's offense today, is I was like, they're not just getting guys into space like I was hoping they would. And Geno's able to just hit his back foot on time and deliver where he's obviously being coached to deliver. And the first read is open and we got a positive play. They're not getting any of that, like Kevin O'Connell was able to do for Minnesota, or Mike McDaniel always does for Miami, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very clear that Shane Waldron's not even that. It's like, he can't even get into the second part of the progression. The only thing he could get is on a scramble drill, right? Or something underneath, it's
the other big concern, I think, is that you look at the struggles from Seattle today, you look at the struggles from the Arizona Cardinals, and one of the positives is that both of those teams ran the ball very effectively. And even if that long term is a losing game, if you're not bringing the dynamism from the passing offense as well, there is a way in which you have successful plays. You're moving the ball. You have some pressure taken off of your quarterback. I don't know yet what the initial contact average is going to be for the Chicago Bears runners. And I've said that I didn't feel like DeAndre Swift played particularly well, but it's going to be bad. There's no room to run the ball. So you don't have anything with the run game structure that is stressing the defense. And then even Williams' mobility, he makes that big time throw, the signature play, the one that makes you feel like, okay, this guy is still going to be a superstar. But one of the things that we did get to see from Nix today, despite how poorly everything else went, was that he was able to make plays with his legs, and that does potentially cause a little bit of a problem for the defense. You didn't get the impression that Williams' legs were stressing the defense today either. So in the three different areas that the Chicago Bears could potentially be dynamic in, or at least cause some problems for the defense, none of those things worked. And if none of them are working, you don't have a foothold to build something else off of. Now, you've got two very athletically dynamic receivers in DJ Moore and Rome Odunze, and you've got maybe the NFL's best or top five route runner in Keenan Allen. If you have that route running and you have that athletic dynamism, it's very possible that the switch will flip and that they will suddenly be there with it because the talent is there. I think that you still want to be excited about the talent, but it may be that the Titans defense is going to be something that is a problem for people. We don't know all of those things yet.
Yeah.
But you would have liked to have seen one element of the offense work, and I really want to see Caleb Williams run the ball more. For our thesis that we mentioned just last night when we were drafting to play out, he's got to run if nothing else works. You have to challenge the defense. You've got to
and I think
create plays that allow you to keep the drive going. Like, you've got to convert some first downs.
Yep. I think the way you said that is perfectly right. And it makes me think to your other question about, do I feel comfortable playing them? I mean, I think it's no. And I think I need to see it first because there's so many options. And I don't think they're all going to hit at once. I think we're going to find out whether it is an offense that's going to rely on Keenan Allen to get open for 10, 11 targets a game and be the foundational part of the offense and everything else works off of that. Or it's an offense that relies on the athleticism of DJ Moore to be the thing that really opens up everything else or whatever. Something is going to, if it improves, and we're hoping it does, something I think is going to hit sort of first in a way that's like, that's the thing that feels like it's more reliable, I think. But like you said, nothing worked, right? So like, what's the thing that's actually going to show us something? And then we'll feel like we can play it. I mean, sometimes we like to be early rather than late in those types of things, but it is hard for me to envision. It could be a Dunze, right? It could be a Dunze after this game where Allen gets 11 targets, DJ Moore gets 8. They catch 5 and 4 for a total of 65 yards. The yards per target here is atrocious on both of them. And I think at Dunze, I haven't seen routes, but I have to assume his routes were a little bit lower and stuff. Maybe they make him a focal point right away next week or something. I don't know. I mean, it could be a lot of different things. You'd like to see them use Cole Kmet more, he's an athletic player too. They have so much talent. It shouldn't be that hard. I mean, honestly, John here in the chat says it only looks easy if you're good at it. I don't know if that's meant to be a knock on Caleb. I will say that, I don't know that I agree with that. If it is a knock on Caleb, the team I would point to, Shawn, we didn't talk about them because you haven't had a chance to watch the game yet. I'm sure you saw the score. The Saints win 47-10 today. People talked all offseason about the Saints offense last year, not using enough motion, not being modern enough. They were bottom of the league in play action, all that stuff. They bring in Clint Kubiak. The expectation was they were going to modernize in some of those ways. I didn't have huge hopes for them. Derek Carr, 19 and 23, 200 yards, 3 touchdowns today, looked very good. Right from the jump, he hits Shaheed. He looks in this offense today against a bad Panthers defense. And we talked from the top. You got to keep in mind, like you just said, the Titans could end up being a really good defense, and the Panthers might end up being one that everyone beats. But Carr hasn't looked like this to me in a while. He's a guy that you've been high on. But I was watching today and going, maybe the new offensive coordinator is really helpful.
Ben, every time that Derek Carr has a decent game, I think to myself, it's not completely wasted, because Ben has to live through him being in the Superflex for our RV Triflex Dynasty team.
You're going to keep torturing me with Derek Carr. Yeah, that's it's not wasted because he's in our lineup. Yeah, no. We got the points for that. That was great. I was stoked. We always have him in a lineup. That's true. Yep. All right, well, anything else? The Bears you mentioned, did you have any other big notes?
Those are the main ones. I have some notes on Will Levis, but I don't want to end the show on obviously it wasn't a high note with the Bears, but
I want to hear your Will Levis take for sure.
Well, this is, I guess, in some ways assumed, since we talked about the Bears side of it, and we know that they won the game.
They still won the game.
There were 10 yards in the first 17 plays of this game. The game actually, in some ways, went downhill from there. I don't know. Every week there's a game that just didn't quite do what people were hoping. And certainly Caleb Williams didn't do it. This archetype of the extremely athletic, hopefully competitive, big-armed QB is one that we love for fantasy. And I do think that when quarterback is very difficult to project, that it does make sense, especially when you get good prices, to lean into that to an extent. Because if it hits, it doesn't really matter that the quarterback wasn't that good statistically before hitting. We know that Josh Allen wasn't particularly good in a lot of different metrics before becoming this unicorn. We know that Anthony Richardson has maybe the worst underneath passing numbers of all time. He would tell you, look at the deep throws. Those are the ones that matter. I'm also going to run it. You get levels of it, though, and there is a level that simply doesn't work. And that's probably where Will Levis is. I had mentioned that his numbers were there with Zach Wilson and Bryce Young last year, and that because of Bryce Young's pedigree, I thought it was more realistic to be patient with him. I'll have to watch the game. We'll have to watch next week. You don't want to give up after 1 week, even as poorly as last season went. I do think it probably makes sense to pretty quickly flip that way of looking at it, simply because Will Levis does bring the type of athleticism, but at that level down from what you're looking at with Josh Allen and Anthony Richardson, that if things could click, it would vaguely work for the reality team. If the rest of the team is really good, I don't think you can really get to the point where he pulls a team, puts a team on his back like Josh Allen, or where it works in context like with Anthony Richardson. I think that he would still have to be carried by his team. but it would be fun from a fantasy perspective and interesting from a reality perspective if he hit that. On a lot of the plays today, though, I mean, Calvin Ridley was wide open for a long touchdown, but then had to work kind of back to the middle of the field because the throw was so late, and then the throw was late and short, and it gets knocked away. He has another play where he's open, arguably, depending on how you're thinking about where the defensive back maybe gave up because he could see the ball was thrown like 15 yards out of bounds, but a 67-yard touchdown. Ridley looked fast. And this is the thing that, he claimed about last season. Yeah, I missed some plays, but the offense wasn't that great. I still have it. People can't cover me. Calvin Ridley didn't look very coverable today. It also looked completely irrelevant because Will Levis is both late making the decisions and then very inaccurate on the throws. He did have a cool play to Chig Okonkwo. Okonkwo, you mentioned, was one of the tight ends that scored. That was a cool play where the defender had his guy covered but was unsighted to the ball, and Levis was like, nothing else is working, I'm going to throw it there. And Okonkwo fought through him, made the touchdown grab. Really one of the coolest highlights all afternoon. But I mean, you have to be able to do more than that play.
It worked because it was sort of a back shoulder or what have you, but I mean, it was like underthrown as well. Like Okonkwo had to come back for it. It wasn't like a beautiful pass. It was a good decision because the defender had his back turned, 50-50 ball, put it up, let your guy make a play on the ball in the air. But even in that context, he could have placed it quite a bit better, but he got a TD pass out of it. Yeah, I thought Ridley looked good too. I was impressed. And I thought Tony Pollard looked really good. And the split between Pollard and Spears was surprising. 16 carries to 4. Spears did have 4 catches to Pollard's 3. We did get 7 receptions for these backs. It does seem like this team's going to give us some running back receptions, which is nice. We kept playing it through Spears, the more exciting, younger, electric player. Pollard looked pretty good in this game. I didn't think he had the same exact burst that he had in his prime, but I thought he was agile through the hole, and it was, that the agility more so than the speed was still there for him. Kind of how I described Dobbins to you earlier. I felt like watching him as well, that if they still have that agility and that ability to get through space, then they can get into space. And he did that a couple times.
Well, it opened up very positively. Basically everything he did in the first half. And then they stopped being able to move the ball at all. It looked to me like that was one where it could end up being a huge problem for me. Not just
that's what I thought,
having some Spears, but not having Pollard at
not
that
having
price.
Pollard, yeah,
because that was the part that was encouraging, I thought, for the offense. I don't want to take anything away from Pollard, who looked like a normal back, which was good because he didn't last year. The long touchdown run was through a gaping hole. Almost any running back in the NFL is going to score that play. The good news about it is that he was the guy, like you said, was getting the touches, and they were blocking it open to where he could run through that size of a hole. So those things are positive. He also, go ahead.
Oh, it's so funny because I wrote Tony Pollard, 26-yard TD run. Good hole. Didn't look amazingly explosive relative to his old self. And then I wrote, looked better on other plays, has the agility still. But like same thing that you just said, that touchdown run wasn't really the best one of his day.
He did have a nice play late in the game on a passing route where you got to see him run a real route. And the cut that he made into the center of the field was really Christian McCaffrey-esque in losing his defender and creating a massive amount of space to where, McCaffrey runs these routes where there's someone ostensibly covering him. He makes the cut and suddenly there's, no one else on the screen, more or less. That was what Pollard did on one of his routes today, makes the catch. Again, if you're hoping for Spears to get a lot of high value touches, a play like that is going to push back against it because it was such a nice play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the split starting out this way and Pollard looking good enough to keep the plus side of the split was a little frustrating for Spears as well, because I think Spears is obviously going to do good things and kind of command more work, but it's like that the stuff that Jaylen Warren dealt with for so long. Well, it shouldn't be, but people, the Steelers have thought that Najee Harris was something better than he is. If you're the second guy and they really like the first guy, and even if you're doing awesome stuff, you sometimes struggling to get more work. It's always a little frustrating. I think it might be a little frustrating for Spears in terms of the actual volume, but there might be enough passing overall. There might be enough high value touches that he's, still at least somewhat spot startable in PPR. But yeah, I had the exact same response as you in the early part of the game. I was like, man, why did I not get more Pollard? I kept taking and even after the preseason, I thought he looked so good in the preseason. I wrote that up and I made that point to say he looks better. But I kept being like, well, if I'm going to get one of them, I should just take Spears, because they're so priced so similarly. But I did question that because I thought if the work went one way early, it was going to go towards Pollard. If it was clearly one way, I mean, he was the guy who got the free agent contract. And I question that a bunch.
I disagree with that a little bit, obviously incorrectly, because we've witnessed what happened. But in this situation, when you have drafted a guy and then he has such a good rookie year, I think if you bring in someone as a complement, even if that person has a name and even if you give them a decent running back contract, that you would. And they clearly just don't see it the same way, right?
Yeah.
But Spears is better than people think, even if you think he's good. Blair Andrews had a couple of articles, more or less right before the season started, talking about how Spears' numbers were not just good. I mean, they were among the best in football in some key areas, which are adding value to whatever the play call was, both as a runner and a receiver. The team doesn't see it that way, and it may simply be because Pollard has been good enough in practice that's the way that they're leaning right now. So that is a frustrating one. It is a disappointing one. It's one that very clearly in the short term is going to be wrong in terms of how I've been looking at it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have been playing it that way. The younger back, the not declining one. I know a lot of people have been that, on that line with Spears, particularly. And if Pollard, 16 carries in this game, 3 catches, if he's getting 15 plus touches a week and looking vaguely decent, and those are high value touch, oriented, he's going to be good. He's going to score well. He'll be a back end top 10 running back, probably, even if Will Levis isn't great. But one of the things is if Levis is bad enough.
Yeah, I think the offense will struggle enough. I do still think that this is playable. One of the things that you want to make sure you do after week 1 is you want to admit when you're wrong so that you can recalibrate and figure out what the next actionable step is.
Yep.
For me on this play, I think that you can very quickly admit that you got an important part of the bet wrong and go to phase 2, which is still believing that Spears has sort of an Austin Eckler-esque element to his profile, that even if you now have to be patient, that again, if you're thinking about, exchanging bench players on a redraft home league, if you're thinking about how do I build my dynasty bench so that it's stronger and it's ascending as opposed to declining, Spears is someone that in a lot of cases, I would think you're going to be able to get people who are frustrated enough and for, appropriate reasons, who will be willing to move him in part because it may fit their current needs to move him. I would still be trying to acquire the profile of Spears, which is a pass catcher with elite tackle evading ability. I think as the offense grows, you want to be on the Austin Eckler side of that, not the Melvin Gordon side of it.
That's like a perfect anti-fragility argument. That makes sense. That's good. Good thoughts. I think we talked about every game. We didn't talk about, everyone that we both watched already. We didn't talk about Sunday Night Football. Did you watch Sunday Night Football or just the end?
No, I did. It was, I won't every week, but I didn't want, even inadvertently, to get any Lions, Rams spoilers.
How fun. Jamison Williams, the thesis you've been talking about, the Cooper Kupp play, 21 targets, 14 catches. Kyren Williams.
21 targets may be the full season for JSN. So
let's say that.
Let's celebrate Cooper Kupp.
Let's celebrate Cooper Kupp, who's going to win leagues. Kyren Williams gets all the work out of the Rams backfield. Blake Corum, I believe I saw, didn't play an offensive snap. Ronnie Rivers is the only other one who got offensive touches. Amon-Ra St. Brown only had 3 catches for 13 yards. That was a surprise, but we kind of faded him, so not one that we're hating. People were taking him very high, and he's still going to have great games. He's a superstar.
Yeah. No, this game, it was a nice finish for me going into the show, because in this game I got almost everything right, and the Lions won. So those were the 2 things I really was hoping to have happen. Next week it could be the exact opposite. We didn't draft a ton of Amon-Ra or Sam Laporta. We think that they're fantastic. We think they're going to have good seasons. One of the mild disappointments that I have is that, Jameson Williams is one of my highest exposures in both best ball and redraft and dynasty. But in the leagues where it's not optimized scoring, he was on a lot of benches, and there's a very good chance this is his best game of the season. So you could end up chasing points now, which that would be a disappointing development. But you could see how the speed changes everything in this game tonight. And it's similar to the Tolbert thing in a different price range, in a different talent range, but it's equally important in that if you were a first-round draft pick, if you were a borderline transcendent college football receiver, you were picked in the first round, early-ish first round, even though you were injured, and your team was going to have to more or less redshirt you. If you then committed additional violations and had to miss a chunk of the next year, and your team is still staying patient and you're on the way up, and then everybody talks about you as having been the breakout player of training camp and a guy that now is ready to take the jump, and you're this far along already in your professional career, and you come out and don't do anything in week 1, that's a massive red flag. So even if this
creates a really specific scenario that you just described.
Well, but I'm just saying, like, if you're working through and you're in your third
year, the next time we have a player that has as crazy of a career as Jameson Williams, we'll be able to know what to do.
It's a little bit like in 10 years when Jerry Jeudy has had another decade of great peripherals, and he's on his 4th team, and they've paid him $50 million for no reason, and he's going to be hurt most of the time. The most predictable thing today would be Jerry Jeudy coming to the sideline and pointing to his knee and going to the tent and all of that. That was...
Well, other than T. Higgins not playing.
Right. So those were disappointing. Jeudy was getting open pretty easily. Caught a touchdown. That was nice to see. But yeah, you have to at some point be
Our guy
real
Waddle also
and
got
not
checked
just
out.
hype. He was good, though. He was good. He came back and made some big plays.
Yeah.
So I felt comfortable that was going to happen because I've lowered my exposure. I'm like, I'm going to stop jinxing him. You develop relationships with individual players where you're like, for both of us, it's going to be best if I just back off a little bit.
Let you spread your wings a little bit. Go score for somebody else. Oh, that's fantastic. What a fun day. Week 1, almost in the books. There's one more game tomorrow night. We get Aaron Rodgers' triumphant return to the New York Jets, where he's played 6 snaps in his career. But no, a great game tomorrow. We have Breece Hall and Christian McCaffrey in the same game. We have Garrett Wilson, who we haven't gotten to see yet. Ayuk is back. Debo, Kittle. A lot of star power on Monday Night Football. But other than that game so far, the rest of week 1 is in the books. We've gotten to see 30 of the 32 teams. Tons of information has been gleaned, but also tons more will change and will become trends and all of those types of things. You were just so sharply talking about that with the Titans backfield, for example, that we have to frame, okay, the week 1 trend was Tony Pollard got all this work and looked pretty good, but still the underlying long view thing would want you to bet on that really good receiving back, Tyjae Spears, as well. But Shawn, I was scrolling back through the comments looking for a different comment. I missed this one earlier. It looks like the most important part of Sunday. They were chanting Bucky, Bucky, Bucky at the game today. Source, I was there.
That's a good source. I like that.
That's a good one.
That could be comment of the year. I don't know if we're going to get challenged for that because you can chant that on the podcast too.
Yeah, you're Bucky. The other one I saw that I was looking for was Jordan here said, watching from Australia. Appreciate both your knowledge every show. We appreciate you in Australia. Let all your Australian friends know we might need to become the international show, Shawn, because we went 3 hours after the game tonight. It's almost midnight here on the West Coast. Our East Coast friends long since gone to bed.
Well, I don't know
tired.
the time zones, but it seems like Australia is a much easier viewing experience.
Right. So we got to get all. We got to capture the Yeah. We got to capture the Australian market for sure. We will be back every Sunday doing this, at least until it kills us. At which point we won't be back. We'll do something during the week, I'm sure, as well. Some type of normal, whatever we figure out. We haven't really talked about it yet, but preview type show or something. But we're underway, Shawn. It's the end of week 1. We did it. We made it.
Yeah, and it was a blast. Strikes and gutters, but overall, the Aussies. Love it.
The comment that just says, ha, 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 the Aussies.
All right. I'm hoping that, we may get Colin Kelly tuning in from Ireland here at some point. Again, I don't know exactly the time frame, but it's got to wrap back around over there in Europe. So I want to finish by saying anybody who is still on, we love you. Anybody who participated for any moment of the show, thank you so much. Everybody who listens during the week, it's big for us. Please subscribe here for Ben on Stealing Signals. Leave a like, do the notifications, all of those things. Anything that will help with the algorithm as our robot overlords decide who watches what. We appreciate all of those things. Good luck to you tomorrow night. We love you guys.
I have an outro music. This has been Stealing Bananas. See ya.